Hollis Draycott slammed the ledger onto Cordelia Wrenford's desk, so hard the inkwell rattled. "Sign it," he said. "Sign it, or I'll make sure every man in Larkspur Crossing knows you can't run this ranch without a man telling you what to do." Cordelia didn't flinch. She had learned a long time ago that men like Draycott mistook stillness for weakness. She looked at the ledger, then back at him, and said nothing. "You think you're something," Draycott said, his voice dropping low in a way that was meant to feel like a warning. 2,000 acres and not a husband in sight. People are already talking, Cordelia. You really want to give them more to say? She picked up the ledger, closed it, and set it on the edge of the desk facing him. "Get off my property," she said, "and don't come back." He left laughing. That was the part that stayed with her, not the threat, not the ledger full of numbers she already suspected were wrong, but the sound of Hollis Draycott laughing as he walked out of Silver Briar Ranch like a man who had already won something. If this story pulled you in from the very first line, you're exactly the kind of viewer this channel was made for. We tell stories about ordinary people facing impossible choices, and we don't stop until every thread is resolved. Subscribe now and ring that bell so you never miss what comes next. And while you're here, drop a like and leave a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Now let's go back to Silver Briar and find out what happens when a wealthy woman posts a simple notice for one ranch hand and 3 strangers show up at her gate instead. The notice had been straightforward. Cordelia had written it herself, standing at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold beside her, choosing every word with the same deliberateness she applied to everything on the ranch. Experienced ranch hand sought. Winter through spring. Excellent wages, private bunkhouse, permanent position for the right candidate. Inquire at Silver Briar Ranch, Larkspur Crossing. She had sent it with the mail rider on a Tuesday morning and expected responses by the following week. What she had not expected was to look out her front window on a gray Thursday and see a man standing at the gate with 2 children beside him. She watched them for a moment before she moved. The man was tall, somewhere north of 6 feet, with the kind of posture that came from years of physical work, not rigid, but settled, like a fence post that had been planted deep and had weathered a few hard seasons since. He wore a coat that had been mended at both elbows. His hat was decent but old. Beside him stood a girl who looked about 12, with dark hair pulled back and an expression on her face that Cordelia recognized immediately, the look of a child who had been standing guard over something fragile for a long time. The smaller one, maybe 6 or 7, had one hand wrapped around her father's and was looking at the ranch house with eyes that were too serious for her age. Everything they had with them fit inside 2 saddlebags and a wooden trunk strapped to the back of a horse that looked like it had seen considerably more miles than it had left in it. Cordelia set down her coffee cup and went outside. "You're here about the notice," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, ma'am." The man removed his hat. His name, he told her, was Bastian Crowther. He had 15 years of cattle experience across 3 states, had managed herds as large as 800 head, understood winter grazing rotations, could read livestock health without a veterinarian, and had his own tools. He said all of this without rushing, the way a man recites facts he has had to prove before and expects to have to prove again. Cordelia listened. Then she looked at the 2 girls. "The notice said 1 ranch hand," she said. "It did," Bastian said. "It didn't mention children." "No, ma'am, it didn't." There was a beat of silence. The older girl's jaw tightened slightly. The younger one moved half a step closer to her father without making a sound. "How old are they?" Cordelia asked. "Merrin's 12. Posy's 7. Their mother passed 3 years ago." Cordelia looked at him steadily. He met her eyes without apology and without performance. He wasn't trying to make her feel sorry for him. That, more than anything else he had said, registered somewhere behind her sternum. "I hired for 1 person," she said, "not a family." Bastian Crowther put his hat back on. He looked at his daughters once briefly, then back at her. "Then judge my work before you judge what came with me," he said. It was not a negotiation tactic. She could tell the difference. It was simply a man stating what he believed to be fair. Cordelia crossed her arms. The wind off the northern pasture pushed a loose strand of hair across her face, and she didn't bother moving it. She was thinking about Hollis Draycott, who had laughed walking out her gate 3 weeks ago, and about the fact that winter was coming, and she had 6 men on this ranch who knew cattle, but not one of them she fully trusted to manage it. 30 days, she said finally. "I'll pay you trial wages. If your work is what you say it is, we talk about permanent." The bunkhouse has one room with a door that locks. Your daughters sleep there. You sleep in the main bunk with the other hands until we know what you are." Bastian nodded. "That's fair. I have rules," she said. "You want to hear them now or after you've put your horse away?" "Now is fine. My hands don't drink on the property. They don't gamble on the property. They don't take anything from the ranch stores without asking first. They do their work without being told twice. They speak to me directly when something is wrong instead of going around. And they don't lie to me." She paused. "That last one isn't negotiable." "None of it sounds negotiable," Bastian said. "It isn't." "Good," he said. "I work the same way." The other 6 hands received the news with varying degrees of enthusiasm, which is to say that most of them had none at all. The eldest among them, a raw-boned man named Cutter, who had worked Silver Briar for 4 years, leaned against the barn door and looked at Bastian, the way a man looks at a weather change he doesn't think he's going to like. "2 little girls," Cutter said, not to Bastian specifically, just to the general air between them. "That's right," Bastian said. He was hanging his tools on the rack inside the barn door, learning where things were kept. "Ranch is no place for children. Plenty of children grew up on ranches. Not on this one." Bastian looked at him then, not with anger, but with the kind of patience that takes more muscle than anger does. "They won't be in your way," he said, "and they won't be your responsibility. Anything else?" Cutter didn't answer. He pushed off the door and walked back toward the pasture fence without another word, and that was the end of the official welcome. By evening, Merrin had the locked bunkhouse room, organized with the efficiency of someone who had unpacked and repacked more times than she could count. She made Posy's side of the room first. The blanket folded the way Posy liked it, the small collection of smooth stones arranged on the windowsill where Posy could see them from her pillow. Then she unpacked her own things, 2 dresses, 3 books, a tin box with their mother's hairpins in it that she never opened but never left behind. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the window and watched her father cross the yard toward the main bunkhouse, his coat collar up against the wind. "Do you think we'll stay?" Posy asked from behind her. Merrin thought about the way the ranch owner had looked at their father. Not unkindly, but carefully. "The way you look at something you're not sure you can trust yet." "I don't know," she said. "I hope we do," Posy said. "I saw a calf when we came in. It was limping. That's not a reason to hope we stay. It's a reason I want to." Merrin didn't say anything to that. She reached over and squeezed her sister's hand once, and then they sat in the dark bunkhouse room and listened to the wind work its way around the corners of Silver Briar Ranch. Bastian started at first light. He didn't wait to be assigned tasks. He walked the eastern pasture before breakfast and came back with a list scratched in the small notebook he kept in his shotburg pocket, and he brought that list to Cordelia while she was still at the kitchen table with her coffee. "Your eastern section is being overfed," he said. "The western one isn't getting enough. The hay rotation's been set up to favor the near pasture because it's easier, not because it's better for the herd. If you keep feeding this way through winter, you're going to have cattle coming out in spring underweight on the west side and potentially bloated on the east." Cordelia looked at him over her coffee cup. "Draycott set up that rotation. I figured. It makes sense if you want the animals visible from the main road and looking fat when buyers come through. Doesn't make sense for the actual animals." She set her cup down. "Show me." He showed her. They walked the eastern pasture together, and Bastian pointed out what he was seeing: grass cropped unevenly, cattle moving more than they should be, signs of the kind of low-level chronic irritation that doesn't kill animals but wears on them over time. He showed her the same problems on the western side, where the hay wasn't reaching the back quadrant properly, where 3 cows had started crowding the gate at feeding time, because they had learned that the food came late and scarce. Cordelia watched him work through the assessment and noticed that he spoke about the cattle ways she did not like inventory, but like animals with individual behaviors and tendencies that mattered. "How long would it take to reset the rotation?" she asked. "A week if your hands cooperate. 2 if they don't." "They'll cooperate," she said. He looked at her sideways. "Even Cutter?" "Especially Cutter. He hates being wrong more than he hates being told what to do. Show him the evidence, and he'll come around." Bastian nodded, writing something in his notebook. "You know your people. It's my job to know them," she said. "Same as it's yours now." The first real complication arrived on day 4, not from the hands or the cattle, but from a woman named Mrs. Adele Ferris, who owned the dry goods store in town, and who made it her personal mission to know everything that happened within 10 miles of Larkspur Crossing. She came in a buggy with her daughter, ostensibly to deliver a bolt of winter fabric that Cordelia had ordered 2 months prior. She stayed for 40 minutes. "A widower with 2 children, Mrs." Ferris said, turning her teacup in her hands with the careful attention of someone who wanted to appear casual. "That's an unusual hire for a woman in your position, Cordelia." "I hired an experienced cattle hand," Cordelia said. "His family situation is his business." Of course. It's just that people will talk. People talk regardless." Mrs. Ferris smiled with her mouth only. "I only mention it because your reputation in this valley matters. Not just to you, but to your ranch. Buyers take their cues from community perception. If they see Silver Briar taking in those children are not strays," Cordelia said. Her voice was level. The temperature of the room was not. "I know what you meant, Adele." Cordelia set down her own cup. "And I appreciate your concern. But my hiring decisions are made based on competence, not on whether Larkspur Crossing approves of the hire's family arrangements. Is there anything else I can help you with today?" Mrs. Ferris left somewhat sooner than she had planned. But the conversation sat with Cordelia longer than she wanted it to. Not because she doubted her decision, because she knew that Adele Ferris didn't drive out 10 miles to deliver fabric personally. She drove out because she had heard something, or suspected something, or wanted to plant something, and Cordelia could not yet tell which. Merrin was the one who solved the calf problem. It had been limping since before they arrived, a detail Posy had noticed on the first day. One of the hands, a quiet young man named Ferris, had been monitoring it but hadn't determined the cause. He thought it might be a hoof infection, which would mean calling for the veterinarian from the next town over at considerable expense. Posy spent 2 days sitting near the calf in the outer pen, not approaching, just being present, until the animal stopped startling when she moved. Then she crouched beside it and looked at its front left leg for a long time. "There's something in there," she told Merrin, "between the toes. It's small, but it's been there a while." Merrin told their father, who looked and confirmed it, and who then spent 20 minutes with a pair of clean pliers and a steady hand removing a piece of fence wire no longer than his thumbnail that had worked its way deep into the tissue. The calf was walking normally within 3 days. Ferris watched the whole procedure. Afterward, he looked at Posy with something that might have been the beginning of respect. "How'd you know to look there?" he asked. "She was protecting it," Posy said. "When she walked, she held it away from everything. Like she was trying to keep it from touching anything." Ferris thought about that. "Huh," he said. "It was a small thing. But small things accumulate on a ranch the way they accumulate everywhere, quietly, below the surface, until one day you look up and the shape of something has changed." Cordelia came down to the barn one evening near the end of the first week and found Bastian at the workbench with a ledger open beside him and the lamp turned up high. He was making notes in a separate column beside Draycott's old entries. "What are you doing?" she said. He looked up without guilt. "Going through Draycott's inventory records." "I can see that." "I'm asking why." He set down the pencil. "Because I counted the herd this morning. And then I counted it again this afternoon. And both counts came up 43 head short of what this ledger says you're supposed to have." The air in the barn shifted. Cordelia came closer. She stood beside him at the bench and looked at the column he'd been building the ledger number, his count, the difference, and next to each discrepancy, a small note about the date of the last recorded entry for that animal. 43, she said, at least. "I may have missed some in the far northern section. I haven't walked it completely yet." "That's a significant number." "Yes, ma'am, it is." She was quiet for a moment. "How long do you think this has been going on?" He tapped the ledger. "Based on the pattern in the entries, I'd say the irregularities start about 8 months back. Maybe 9. But they're entered carefully. Whoever did this understood how to make the numbers look like rounding errors and seasonal variation instead of deliberate removal." Cordelia looked at the figures for a long time. Then she looked at Bastian. "You've been here 6 days. I have. You found this in 6 days. He picked up the pencil again. "I wasn't looking for it. I was counting cattle for the rotation adjustment. It's just what the number said when I counted." She pulled a stool over and sat down. "Show me everything you found." They were there for 2 hours. The lamp burned down and Bastian trimmed the wick twice without being asked. When they finished, Cordelia had a list of 27 specific entries that showed clear evidence of manipulation, and the beginnings of a pattern that pointed to how the cattle had been moved out of Silver Briar's accounting without appearing on anyone's immediate radar. She rolled up the separate sheet of notes. "I'm going to need my attorney to look at this." "Yes," Bastian said. "Don't mention this to the other hands yet." "I won't." She stood, looked at the ledger, then at him. "You could have left this alone. Come in, done your rotation work, collected your wages." "I could have," he said. "Most people would have." He closed the ledger. "Most people don't have daughters watching to see what they do when it matters." Cordelia walked back to the house and sat in the kitchen for a long time in the dark, with the list of numbers in her hand and the sound of the wind outside, and the particular feeling of a woman who has just discovered that the problem she thought she was managing is considerably larger than she understood, and who has also, possibly, found the one person on this ranch she might actually be able to trust. On day 11, Draycott came back. He didn't come to the gate. He came to the edge of the western pasture, where 3 of the hands were working on fence posts, and he stood on the public road side of the fence and talked loud enough that they could hear him clearly. Cordelia got word of it from Ferris, who came to the house looking uncomfortable. "He's saying Crowther's been altering the records," Ferris said. "Saying he's seen this before a man comes in, earns trust fast, gets access to the books, starts changing numbers before anyone notices." Cordelia set down what she was holding. How many hands heard him? All 3 that were on the west fence. And I think Cutter was nearby. She walked out to the western fence herself. By the time she got there, Draycott had gone, but the 3 hands were standing in a loose, uneasy cluster with the particular body language of men who have just heard something they don't know what to do with. "Get back to work," she said. They did. She found Cutter near the water trough. "What did Draycott say?" Cutter's expression was carefully neutral. "Said Crowther changes books. Said he did it at his last place, too." "Do you believe him?" Cutter was quiet for a moment. He was not a stupid man, which was why he was also not a man who answered questions like this quickly. "I don't know what to believe," he said finally. "I know that Crowther found problems in those records, but I also know he's the one who's had his hands in them." "I was sitting with him when he found those problems," Cordelia said. Cutter looked at her. "Then why's Draycott so sure?" "Because Draycott put those problems there," she said. "And if someone else doesn't get blamed for them, he's going to have to answer for them himself." She walked back to the house and wrote 2 letters, one to her attorney, one to the livestock registry office in the county seat, and sent them with the mail rider before noon. That evening, Bastian came to the house. He stood on the porch without knocking, which was unusual, and when Cordelia opened the door, he was holding his hat in both hands, with his fingers working around the brim in the way that people do when they are about to say something they have rehearsed and still aren't sure about. "I heard what Draycott said," he told her. "I know. I want you to know that." "I know what you're going to say," she interrupted, not harshly. "And I don't need you to say it." He stopped. "I've been running this ranch for 9 years," she said. "I've made exactly 3 bad hires in that time. You'd like to think I can't tell the difference between a man who's working a scheme and a man who's working a pasture." She looked at him steadily. "Can you tell me which one you are?" "I think you already know," he said. "I do," she said, "but I want to hear you say it." There was a silence that had some weight to it, the kind of silence that isn't empty. "I'm working your pasture," Bastian said, "and I intend to keep doing it until you tell me to stop." "Good," she said. "Then go get some sleep. We're checking the north section tomorrow, and I want to start at first light." He put his hat back on, turned to leave, then paused. "My daughters," he said. "Whatever happens with this, they had nothing to do with." "Bastian." Her voice was firm. "Go to sleep," he went. The north section was a 3-hour ride, and Cordelia brought Merrin. She hadn't planned to. But when she walked out to find Bastian saddling horses in the early dark, Merrin was already him check the cinches with the practiced ease of a girl who had been doing it since she was old enough to reach. Cordelia had looked at the child for a moment, then at Bastian, then said, "Can she ride?" "She can," Bastian said. "Then she comes. Extra pair of eyes won't hurt." Merrin had said nothing. She had simply gone to fetch her coat, and when she came back, her expression was the same serious, watchful look she always wore, except that something around the edges of it was slightly different, less braced, maybe, like a door that had been pulled back a half-inch from its frame. They rode north in near silence, the 3 of them, through the gray pre-dawn and into the flat white light of a Wyoming morning. The northern section of Silver Briar was the oldest part of the ranch, farthest from the road, bounded by a low ridge on the east that made it less useful for easy cattle management. Draycott had logged it as largely unused for the past year. That was the first thing Cordelia had marked in her letter to the attorney. Because pasture didn't become unused on a working ranch unless someone decided to stop using it. They found the gate at the north section's boundary ajar. Not broken. Not forced. Just open. The way a gate looks when someone has passed through it repeatedly and stopped bothering to close it fully. Beyond the gate, in the shallow depression behind the ridge, where the grass had been protected from the wind and had grown thick, there were cattle. Bastian rode in first, and Cordelia followed, and they both stopped their horses at roughly the same moment when they saw the markings. "These aren't our cattle," Cordelia said. "Some of them are," Bastian said. He was already dismounting, moving toward the nearest animal with his notebook open. "Look at the ear tags." Merrin had already ridden past them both, moving along the edge of the small herd with her eyes sharp. "There," she said, pointing. "That one, and the black one behind it." Bastian looked at his notebook. Then he looked at the cattle she'd indicated. The ear tags had been altered, not replaced entirely, just changed in 2 digits, using a tool that had done the job quickly, and not with great precision. "These numbers," Merrin said. She pulled up beside him. "I've seen them. In the ledger. When you were showing Miss Wrenford," she stopped briefly, and something crossed her face. "When you were showing her the inconsistencies. These match the entries from March." Bastian looked at his daughter. Cordelia looked at Merrin. "You remember specific ledger entries?" Cordelia said. Merrin didn't look embarrassed. "I remember numbers," she said. "I always have. There were 61 head of cattle in the Northern Depression. 57 of them, when Bastian cross-referenced against his notebook on the ride back, matched the discrepancies in Draycott's altered records. The other 4 had been moved in from a neighboring property, whether knowingly or not, in a way that would have made the whole assembly look like legitimate grazing if anyone had bothered to check, which until 6 days ago no one on Silver Briar had. Bastian was quiet on the ride back. Merrin rode ahead at Cordelia's side, the two of them talking in low voices about the ear tag alterations and what it would take to document them properly before the cattle were moved again. Bastian listened to his daughter talk about livestock records, with the vocabulary of someone who had been quietly absorbing everything around her for years, and he felt the particular combination of things a parent feels when they see a child becoming something proud, and frightened, and aware that he had very little to do with any of it. When they got back to the ranch, Cordelia sent Merrin inside for food and warmth, and stood with Bastian at the barn door. "She's remarkable," Cordelia said. "I know. She was scared when she corrected herself, when she called me." Cordelia paused, when she said "Mama," and then stopped. Bastian was quiet. "She doesn't have to stop herself," Cordelia said. It was not a declaration. It was just a sentence, said the way you say something true that needs air. He looked at her. She was already turning toward the house. The attorney's name was Harlan Peck, and he arrived from the county seat 4 days later, on a morning that had turned cold enough to see your breath. He spent 3 hours with the ledger and Bastian's documentation and the notes from the North Section visit, and then he sat across from Cordelia at the dining table and laid out what he believed could be proven. "Removal of cattle from a registered herd without documentation is theft," he said. "If we can connect the altered ear tags to Draycott's period of management and tie that to the sales records at the livestock exchange, we have a case." "And the ledger alterations?" Cordelia asked. "Supporting evidence. Taken together with the physical location of the cattle and the tag modifications." He looked at his notes. "It's not airtight, but it's substantially more than nothing. What does Draycott say when he finds out we've found the cattle? He'll claim someone else moved them. He'll suggest Crowther set this up to deflect suspicion." Peck glanced at Bastian, who was sitting at the end of the table, which is why the timing matters. "You found this on day 12 of his employment. The alterations date back 8 months. Those dates don't line up for a frame." "They don't," Bastian said. "But that won't stop someone from suggesting it." "No," Peck agreed, "it won't." The room was quiet for a moment. Outside, Posy was in the yard with Ferris, checking on the calf that had been limping, which was now walking well enough that it had started following her around the pen, with the devoted attention of an animal that had decided it owed someone a debt. "What do you need from me?" Cordelia asked. "A formal statement documenting when Crowther found the discrepancies, with your confirmation that you were present." photographs of the north section, and an independent count of the cattle by someone who isn't employed by the ranch. I can get you the count, Bastian said. There's a livestock man in Ridgeway Tenor Oaks who does independent assessments for insurance purposes. He's known in the county, and he doesn't have a stake in this. Peck nodded. Get me Oaks, I'll handle the rest. That night, Draycott sent someone to the ranch. Not Draycott himself, a man who arrived at the main gate just before dark, gave his name as a former hand looking for work, and asked to speak to the foreman. Cutter turned him away. But not before the man had spent 10 minutes at the gate talking in low, unhurried tones about a friend of his who had heard some troubling things about a new hire at Silver Briar, about records that had been altered, about a man who moved around a lot because he had to. Cutter came to Cordelia after dinner and told her this plainly, the way he told her things, without embellishment. What do you make of it? She asked. He thought for a moment. I make of it that Draycott's worried, he said. Worried men don't send messengers unless they've got something to lose. Do you believe what the man said about Crowther? Cutter was quiet for a long time. Long enough that Cordelia thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, I believe Crowther knows cattle. I believe he found what he says he found. And I believe a man doesn't bring his children somewhere he plans to steal from. He stood up, put his hat on, and nodded to her once in the way that meant the conversation was finished. At the door, he paused. That little one, he said. Posy. What about her? The calf follows her now. Everywhere. He shook his head. Slightly, not dismissively, but in the way of a man who has seen a lot of the world and has not entirely stopped being surprised by it. Kids like that don't come from bad stock. He left. Cordelia sat with the lamp for a while after he was gone, and she thought about 30 days that were becoming something else, and about a man who hadn't begged her to trust him, and about a 12-year-old girl who remembered ledger numbers, and a 7-year-old who had looked at a limping calf and understood what it was protecting. She thought about what it would mean if they left. And then she thought about what it would mean if they didn't. She went to her desk and wrote a third letter, this one to the livestock exchange in the county seat, requesting the full transaction record for Hollis Draycott over the past 18 months. She sent it before she went to bed, and in the locked room of the bunkhouse, 2 girls slept with their belongings still unpacked on the shelves, for the first time in 3 years not expecting to be told to pack them again. Ten Oaks arrived on a Tuesday with mud on his boots and a leather satchel that looked like it had survived a flood or two, which it probably had. He was a compact man, somewhere in his late 50s, with the kind of face that had stopped being readable sometime around his 40th year and stayed that way. He didn't introduce himself with much ceremony, just handed Cordelia his credentials, looked at Bastian once with the assessing squint of a man who spent his professional life, deciding what things were actually worth, and said he'd need 2 days. He got 2.5. The north section took longer than expected, because the terrain behind the ridge had more natural breaks in it than the survey map suggested, which meant cattle had scattered into 3 separate pockets, instead of holding together the way they had when Cordelia and Bastian first found them. On the morning of the 3rd day, Oaks sat at the kitchen table with his count sheets spread out, and a cup of coffee going cold at his elbow because he kept forgetting to drink it. 63 head confirmed in the north section, he said. Of those, 59 matched the tag series documented in your discrepancy records. The other 4 carry markings from the Bellard operation 2 properties east of here. I'd suggest you contact Bellard separately. Could be innocent drift, could be something else, but that's a different matter. And the alterations, Cordelia asked, consistent across the 59. Same tool, I'd guess same pressure pattern on the metal, same angle of modification. Whoever did it worked fast and didn't expect anyone to look close. He picked up his coffee, remembered it was cold, set it back down. Someone did the same thing to 3 animals on your main pasture count. I found them this morning before you were up. Tag them with survey tape so you can check. Cordelia looked at Bastian across the table. He was looking at his notebook, but his jaw had gone tight in the way it did when he was working something through. 3 more, he said. That wasn't in my count. Your count was good, Oak said. You caught the bulk of it. These 3 had been moved back into the main herd sometime recently last week, maybe less. Could be someone was trying to muddy the water. The kitchen was quiet for a moment. Merrin was at the far end of the table with a schoolbook open, but she wasn't reading it. She was listening with the stillness of a child who has learned that the best way to be present in an adult conversation is to appear to be doing something else. "What's your professional opinion?" Cordelia asked Oakes. He looked at her directly. "My professional opinion is that you had a systematic removal of livestock from your registered herd over a period of approximately 8 to 10 months. It was managed carefully enough that it wouldn't show up in a casual inventory, and the ledger work was done by someone who understood enough about bookkeeping to make individual discrepancies look like errors rather than patterns." He paused. "It stopped being careful around month 7. That's usually when this kind of thing falls apart. The person doing it either gets greedy or gets nervous, and both make them sloppy." "Draycott got nervous," Bastian said. "What made him nervous?" Oakes asked. Bastian was quiet. Cordelia answered. "We think he found out I was looking at the ledger more carefully than he expected." Oakes nodded slowly. "That'd do it." He packed his satchel and left before noon, with a signed statement that Cordelia's attorney would collect directly from his office. At the gate, he paused and looked back at the ranch, not with any particular expression, just the look of a man making a final assessment of something. "You've got a good operation here," he said to Cordelia. "The rotation Crowther set up on the eastern pasture that's going to show results by spring. Whoever you had before him wasn't paying attention to the land." He rode out before she could respond to that, which was probably just as well. Harlan Peck presented the documentation to the County Livestock Authority 10 days later. He did not go to the sheriff first, which was a deliberate choice. Livestock authorities had jurisdiction over branded and tagged animals in a way that moved faster and with less public theater than a criminal complaint. And Peck had been practicing law in this county long enough to know that public theater had a way of becoming the story instead of the facts. Draycott found out anyway. Cordelia didn't know how, but she had learned over the years that information in a small settlement moved in ways that had nothing to do with who was supposed to know what. By the time the authorities' investigator rode out to inspect the north section, Draycott had already been to the Larkspur Crossing post office, the feed store, and at least 2 households telling a version of events that placed Bastian Crowther at the center of everything. She heard about it from 3 different sources in the space of 2 days. The feed store version had Bastian altering records going back to his previous employer in another county. The post office version had him running a scheme that involved selling cattle under false names and routing the money through a fictitious business. The household version, which came from a woman whose husband had done business with Draycott for years, was vaguer but uglier, carrying the particular suggestion that a man traveling with 2 young daughters and no wife and no fixed address must have something to hide. That last one made Cordelia's chest go tight in a way the others didn't. She didn't tell Bastian about that one. She wasn't sure why. Maybe because she thought he already knew that Draycott's instinct would be to reach for the easiest damage he could do. And the easiest damage you could do to a widowed man was to make people look at his children sideways. Maybe because she thought that if she said it out loud in front of him, something in the careful, patient way he was managing himself through this would finally break. And she wasn't sure yet what would be on the other side of that. What she did tell him was that the investigator had been to the north section, that the documentation was with the authority, and that Peck believed the formal findings would come back within 2 to 3 weeks. Bastian listened to this with his hat in his hands, standing at the corner of the barn the way he always stood when they talked about anything he considered serious, not inside the barn, not fully in the open, but at the threshold where he could see both directions. 2 or 3 weeks, he said. That's what Peck said. Things don't move that fast usually. Peck is good at his job. Bastian turned his hat over once. Draycott's been telling people I changed those numbers. I know. Some of your hands believe him. She looked at him steadily. Do you know that for certain, or are you guessing? He was quiet for a moment. I can see it in how they stand when I walk past. Not all of them, but enough. She believed him. Bastian Crowther was not a man who wasted energy imagining things that weren't there. I'm talking to each of them, she said, individually. That'll make it worse. If they think you're managing them because of me, they'll resent both of us. She hadn't considered that. She stood with it for a moment, acknowledging the point without enjoying it. What would you do instead? He looked out across the eastern pasture, which had started to show the first small effects of the rotation adjustment. The cattle were distributing more evenly. The crowding at the near feeding station had eased off. It was not a dramatic change, but it was visible if you were looking for it. Let the work speak, he said. It's the only thing that will. Anything else I say or you say is just noise on top of what Dracot's already said, and he has a head start on us. Cordelia looked at the pasture too. That's a hard thing to sit with, she said. Yes, ma'am, he said. It is. Posy had started doing something that no one had formally asked her to do, which was to check on the weaker animals at the edge of the herd each morning before breakfast. Not the sick ones, those were handled by Ferris and occasionally Bastian, but the ones that weren't sick exactly, just not quite right. The ones that hung at the back of the group and moved a little slower. The ones that weren't eating with the same push and confidence as the animals around them. She had a way of approaching them that Cordelia noticed one morning from the fence rail, not slow and cautious, the way most people approached nervous cattle, but steady and unhurried in a way that was somehow different from cautious. Cautious implied that the animal might do something, and you were accounting for it. What Posy did was more like she had simply decided that nothing alarming was going to happen, and the animal, picking up on this certainty, tended to agree. Ferris had started leaving a small bucket of supplemental feed at the end of the barn for her. He never mentioned it. She never thanked him for it. They had arrived at an arrangement of mutual understanding that did not require words, which is the best kind. Cordelia mentioned this to Bastian one afternoon when she found him fixing a section of fence in the southwest corner. She's always been like that, he said, driving a staple with 2 clean strikes, since she was about 4. We had a dog that was going lame old dog, nothing to be done about it really, but she'd sit with it for an hour at a time, just keeping it company. Never tried to fix it, just stayed near it. That's a particular kind of patience, Cordelia said. Her mother had it. He drove another staple, the ability to be useful by doing nothing that looks like anything. Cordelia stood at the fence and let that sit for a moment. What was she like? Their mother. Bastian didn't stop working, but there was a slight change in the rhythm of it. Stubborn, he said. Smarter than most people gave her credit for, because she was quiet about it. She died of a fever that came on fast and got worse faster. Merrin was 9. Posy was 4. He set the hammer down and looked at the fence line. After that, we moved around a lot. I kept thinking the next place would be the right one. Was it ever? He picked the hammer back up. No. She didn't say anything to that. Sometimes the honest answer to a question is the end of that particular conversation, and pushing past it is a form of rudeness dressed up as interest. She stayed at the fence for another few minutes, watching him work, and then walked back toward the house. On the 18th day of Bastian's employment, the letter arrived from the livestock exchange in the county seat. Cordelia read it at the kitchen table and then read it again. Then she walked to the desk and got out the ledger and compared 3 specific sets of figures. Then she sat down and wrote a very short note to Harlan Peck that said only, "The exchange records confirm sales of 51 head of cattle attributed to Dracot's personal account across 4 transactions beginning in February. All 4 transactions predate Crowther's employment at Silver Briar by a minimum of 4 months. Please file accordingly." She sent it within the hour. That afternoon, she went to the barn and told Bastian what the letter had said. Not all of it, she didn't read it to him, didn't go through the specific figures. She told him the part that mattered, that the sales happened before he arrived, that the paper trail for Dracot's scheme was now documented from the livestock exchange's own records, which could not be altered by anyone after the fact. Bastian sat on a hay bale and looked at the floor. She waited, because she had learned that he processed things internally before he said anything, and interrupting that process was a waste of both their time. 4 months before I got here, he said finally. Minimum. He nodded. Looked up. There was something in his face that she couldn't quite name, not relief exactly, because relief implies that the danger is past, and it hadn't, not fully. More like the particular steadiness of a man who has been proven right about something he already knew but couldn't prove, and is now adjusting to the fact that the knowing and the proving are 2 different weights. The hands are going to hear about this? He asked. They'll hear about whatever the authorities' findings say, which will be public record. When? Peck says another week, maybe 10 days. Bastian stood up. He didn't say thank you, which she appreciated, because she hadn't done this for him. She'd done it because her cattle were missing, and her foreman had been stealing from her, and she needed the documentation to hold him accountable. Bastian had made the documentation possible by doing his job, and the rest was just consequence. I need to go check on the north fence, he said. We found a section that was cut last season. I think Dracot used it to move the first batch through. Show me when you go, she said. You don't have to. Bastian. She said his name the way she said things she meant once and didn't intend to repeat. Show me when you go. He went and got his horse. Merrin had been quiet for 3 days. Not the regular quiet she wore, like a coat, the deliberate, watchful quiet that meant she was paying attention to everything around her. This was a different kind, the kind that happens when something has lodged in a person and they are deciding what to do with it. Posy noticed first, the way younger siblings always do, because they spend their lives watching one person more carefully than they watch anyone else. She came to find Bastian in the early evening when he was at the workbench sorting through a box of old tools, and she stood at his elbow with her hands clasped in front of her. Merrin's been crying, she said. Not a lot, but some. Bastian set down the tool in his hand. At night. And this morning, when she thought I was still asleep. He looked at his younger daughter for a moment. Posy's face was serious in the particular way it got when she was worried about someone, a careful, focused seriousness. Not the sharpness Merrin wore, but something rounder. Do you know what's upsetting her? He asked. Posy thought about it. I think she got scared, she said, when the men were saying things about you. I think she got scared that it would happen like before. Bastian knew what before was, the last town. A different man with different specific accusations, but the same basic architecture, a man who wanted to cause damage, and knew that the fastest way to do it was to say the right things to the right people until the facts stopped mattering. They'd packed up and left within 2 weeks of it starting, because Bastian had looked at his daughters and decided that no employment was worth watching them be looked at that way. I'll talk to her, he said. Posy nodded. Then, in the precise and practical way that was entirely her own. Also, the roan cow in the East Pen has been grinding her teeth. I think her feed might be too coarse. Bastian reached over and put his hand briefly on the top of her head. I'll look at the feed. You go find your sister. He found Merrin at the back of the bunkhouse room, sitting on the floor with her back against the wall and one of her schoolbooks open on her knees, though she clearly hadn't been reading it. She looked up when he came in. Her eyes were fine. She'd had time to set herself back together, which was a Merrin thing, always had been. He sat down on the floor beside her, didn't say anything immediately. I heard you talking to Posy, she said. I know you did. She turned a page in the schoolbook without looking at it. I'm not crying now. I know. She stopped. Set the book aside. I was thinking about what happens if we have to leave again. Bastian looked at the wall across from them. The bunkhouse room was small, but she'd made it feel less small, the stones on Posy's windowsill, the books in a row, the tin box on the shelf. You put things on the shelves, he said. I know. That was brave. She looked at him sideways. It was stupid. If we leave, then we pack them again and we take them with us, he said. They're still yours either way. She was quiet for a moment. Do you think we'll have to leave? He thought about the livestock exchange letter, about Harlan Peck, about the fence Draycott had cut to move cattle through and had never bothered to repair because he hadn't planned on anyone looking that far north. He thought about Cordelia Wrenford locking the ranch gate and saying 30 days not like a warning, but like a woman who made decisions and intended to honor them. No, he said, I don't think so, but you're not sure. Merrin. She turned to look at him fully. I'm never completely sure, he said. That's what it is to be a person in the world. You make the best decisions you can with what you know, and then you stay steady, and you see what comes. I'm not going to tell you I know for certain things will be fine, because I've told you that before, and I've been wrong. She held his eyes for a moment. This was one of the things about Merrin. She always looked for the lie in what you were saying. Not because she was suspicious of you, but because she had decided a long time ago that she would rather have the true version of a hard thing than a comfortable version of it. But you think it's different here, she said. He thought about it honestly. I think it might be, he said. I'm not sure what that means yet. She picked up her schoolbook. Miss Wrenford asked me if I wanted to learn how ledgers work. The business kind. Not just adding and subtracting. What did you tell her? I said I already know some of it. She said that's a good start. A pause. She said I could look at Silver Briar's business accounts with her if I wanted. For learning. Bastian looked at his daughter. 12 years old. Sitting on a bunkhouse floor with a schoolbook, remembering livestock tag numbers from a ledger she'd seen once. Do you want to? Yes, she said, with the simplicity of someone who knows exactly what they want and is not in the habit of pretending otherwise. He stood up and offered her his hand, and she took it and stood too. And they went out into the cooling evening, where Posy was in the yard, looking at the roan cow over the fence, the focused attention of a very small person conducting a very serious assessment. The cut fence section in the north turned out to be more informative than Bastian had expected. When he brought Cordelia out to see it the next morning, they found not one cut section, but two, and the second one had been repaired, but not with the wire and technique of Silver Briar's regular maintenance. Someone had patched it from the other side, using a different gauge of wire and tying the ends in a way that a hand who had learned fencing on a different property would do it without thinking. Bellard's property is north of that fence, Cordelia said. Yes. You think he knew? Bastian crouched at the patched section and looked at the wire ends without touching them. I think someone who works for him knew. Whether Bellard himself, he shook his head. Can't say. Cordelia stood with her arms crossed and looked at the ridge line. The northern section of her ranch was quietly beautiful in the way that unwatched land gets grass grown, the way it wants rather than the way it's managed. The ridge casting a long morning shadow across the hollow where the cattle had been hidden. She'd walked this fence line maybe twice in the past 2 years. Draycott had told her the north section was too far from the water sources to be practical for sustained grazing. She had believed him because she'd been managing 6 other things, and he'd been the one with his hands in the day-to-day. That was the part she didn't say to anyone, including herself most of the time. That she had trusted Hollis Draycott not because he'd earned it, but because it was convenient to trust him. Because running 2,000 acres with 6 hands and a set of ledgers she was never entirely sure she was reading correctly was already a full life. And adding doubt about the man she'd hired to manage the practical end of it would have made the weight of the whole thing heavier than she'd known how to carry. She didn't blame herself for it, but she also didn't give herself the full pass of pretending it couldn't have gone differently. I want to ride the entire fence perimeter, she said. The whole thing, every section. Bastian stood up. That's 4 days' work. I know. I should have done it already. He looked at her for a moment. We'll start at the eastern boundary tomorrow, he said. It'll take what it takes. They started at the eastern boundary the following morning, just the 2 of them, because it wasn't a task that needed many hands, and Cordelia had learned enough in the past weeks to understand that Bastian Crowther's version of a thorough fence inspection was not something you rushed by adding people to it. They rode in near silence for the most part, which turned out to be a comfortable kind of silence. Not the silence of people who have nothing to say, but the kind between people who have learned enough about each other's working rhythm that they don't need to fill the space. He would stop at a section that concerned him and she would stop too, and one of them would say what they were seeing and the other would look and either agree or add something, and then they'd move on. On the second day, in the southwestern corner, where the fence ran along a creek bed, he told her about the last place they'd worked. He didn't do it formally. It came out of a conversation about fencing near water. She'd asked something practical about the way the creek had eroded the post bases, and he'd said that the creek wasn't the main problem. The main problem was that whoever had done the original post setting hadn't accounted for freeze-thaw movement, and then he'd said that he'd seen it done right on a ranch in eastern Montana, which led to her asking how long they'd been in Montana, which led to a quieter conversation about the year after his wife died, when he'd tried to find stable ground in 3 different places and hadn't managed it. The last place we left, he said. The man who caused the trouble there, it wasn't money. He just decided he didn't like us. That was the whole of it. Sometimes that's enough. Cordelia looked straight ahead along the fence line. It shouldn't be enough. No, but it is in some places. In small places where a man's word counts more than evidence, what someone decides about you in the first week is mostly what they keep deciding. What did he decide? Bastian's jaw tightened briefly. That a man who travels with 2 children and no wife must have something wrong with him. Either that he drove her off, or that the children aren't truly his, or that he's incapable of staying in one place because of some failing that's his own fault. He paused. Once people start deciding that kind of thing, you can't correct it. You just have to leave. She thought about Adele Ferris, sitting at her kitchen table, turning a teacup in her hands. You shouldn't have to. No, he said, but you learn to choose your battles. She looked at him then, not the quick, assessing look she'd been giving him since he arrived, but the kind of look that stays. He was watching the fence line ahead, and the morning light was flat and gray off the creek, and he had the expression of a man who has said something true and isn't sure if he should have. You stayed, she said. He glanced at her. Ma'am? Here. When Draycott started talking, you didn't pack up and go. He was quiet for a moment. I almost did. What stopped you? He took a long time with the answer. They rode past a section of fence that was fine, and then another, and then the creek bent and the light changed, and he said, "You locked the gate." Cordelia looked ahead at the fence line and didn't say anything. The horse under her picked its way along the creek bank with the unhurried confidence of an animal that knows the ground. That was the first time, he said, in 3 years that someone locked a gate to keep us in instead of pushing us out. She didn't answer that either. Some things don't need an answer, so much as they need to be said once and then let sit in the air between two people who are both smart enough to know what they're actually talking about. They rode on. The authorities' formal findings came on day 24. Peck brought them out himself, which was not standard practice, but which Peck apparently felt was warranted by the specifics of the situation. He spread the documents on the dining table and walked Cordelia through them, while Bastian sat across from her, and Merrin, who Cordelia had not asked to leave, sat at the corner with her hands folded. The findings were clear. 51 head of cattle sold through Draycott's personal account using falsified transfer documentation. The alterations to Silver Briar's ledger identified as consistent with a single hand across all entries. The timeline established as beginning 8 months prior to Bastian Crowther's employment and ending approximately 6 weeks before his arrival, which aligned precisely with the period when Cordelia had begun looking more closely at the books, and Draycott had understood that his time at Silver Briar was ending. He was wrapping it up, Peck said. The last sale was 3 weeks before you dismissed him. He was clearing the table before he left. And the accusation against Crowther? Cordelia asked. Peck looked at Bastian without expression. The authorities' findings make no mention of Crowther except as the individual who identified the original discrepancies. His name appears in my documentation as the person who conducted the initial livestock count, and Oakes's independent verification corroborates his count within a margin of 2 head. He paused. There is nothing in the official record that connects Bastian Crowther to any of Draycott's activity. Merrin unfolded her hands. She looked at her father once, quickly, and then looked at the table. Bastian looked at the documents. He did not look relieved in the way people look when they've been proven of something they were never guilty of. He looked like a man absorbing information that confirmed what he already knew, but that now finally had a shape that other people could see. What happens to Draycott? Cordelia asked. The livestock authority will pursue restitution for the value of the cattle. Whether the sheriff gets involved separately is the authority's decision, not mine, but given the scale of it. Peck gathered his papers. He won't be working another foreman position in this county, and likely not the adjacent ones either, once this is in the regional record. After Peck left, the house was quiet for a moment. Then Merrin said, in a voice that was carefully controlled, "So we can stay." It wasn't a question, but it also wasn't a statement. It was the particular verbal shape of a 12-year-old girl who has been afraid to assume something and is now trying to determine whether the fear has been resolved. Cordelia looked at her, then at Bastian. "Your 30 days aren't up yet," Cordelia said to him, "but I think we can assume the evaluation is going well." Something moved through Bastian's face that he didn't fully manage to keep from the surface. Not much, just a small adjustment in the line of his mouth, the set of his shoulders. He nodded once, the way men nod when they don't trust their voice to behave itself. Merrin looked at her father and then looked at the table again, and for just a moment the careful guard she wore on her face came down far enough that she looked exactly like what she was, a 12-year-old who had been carrying something very heavy for a long time and had just been told, tentatively, that she could set a small part of it down. She picked up the schoolbook she'd brought to the table and opened it, and pretended to read. Cordelia stood up to refill the coffee and said nothing more about it, which was the right thing to do. Outside somewhere in the yard, Posy was talking to the calf in the low conversational voice she used with animals, not words exactly, just sound. The particular frequency that said, "I'm here," and not leaving, and the calf was standing at the fence watching her, with the total focused attention of something small that has decided, without fully understanding why, that this is where it belongs. The 30th day came and went without ceremony. Cordelia didn't mark it. Bastian didn't mention it. The work continued the way it had been continuing. The eastern pasture rotation was showing consistent results now. The north section fence had been properly repaired, and the 59 recovered cattle had been documented back into Silver Briar's registered herd with the authorities' official stamp on the paperwork. The ranch moved through the last days of autumn with the particular momentum of a place that has had something broken in it fixed, not perfectly, but functionally. What changed on day 31 was that Cordelia offered Bastian a permanent contract. She did it at the kitchen table, which was where she did most things that mattered, and she put the written terms in front of him, without preamble, wage figure, responsibilities. The bunkhouse room reassigned to the girls as a permanent arrangement, his own room at the end of the main bunkhouse. He read it the way he read everything, slowly and completely, without asking questions until he'd finished. The wage is high, he said. It reflects the work, she said. And what the work has already saved me. He read to the end. Set it down. The room reassignment Cutter's been in that end room for 2 years. Cutter moved himself last week, she said. Said the drafts from the north window were bothering his knee. Bastian looked at her. Did he? He did. There was a pause in which they both understood that Cutter's knee had probably been bothered by that north window for considerably less time than he'd claimed, and neither of them said so. Bastian picked up the pen she'd left beside the contract and signed it at the bottom without further discussion. He wasn't a man who needed to extract additional concessions from a fair deal to feel like he'd negotiated properly. That quality, Cordelia had come to understand, was considerably rarer than it sounded. She took the contract back, filed it in the ranch office drawer where she kept things that mattered, and that was that. Except that it wasn't quite, because nothing in the business of running Silver Briar Ranch stayed settled for long enough to call it that, and Hollis Draycott, despite everything the authorities' findings had established, despite the formal record now sitting in the county office with his name on it, had not finished. The first sign of it came from an unexpected direction. A man named Cale Voss arrived in Larkspur Crossing on a Thursday in early November, and by Friday evening Cordelia had heard his name 3 times. He was, according to the various accounts that reached her, a land assessor, though the word assessor covered a wide range of occupations in the territory, from legitimate county employees to men who showed up in small settlements on behalf of parties who preferred not to introduce themselves directly. Voss had been asking questions around town, not about cattle, about water. Specifically, about the creek that ran through Silver Briar's southwestern corner, the same creek she and Bastian had ridden along during the fence inspection, the one with the eroded post bases and the freeze-thaw damage. The creek that, Cordelia knew, fed 3 other smaller operations downstream and whose source lay on the upper ridge at the northwestern edge of her property. She first heard the word water rights from Ferris, who had been in the feed store when Voss was there and had listened from behind a stack of grain sacks with the focused attention of a young man who had recently learned that paying attention to things that didn't seem directly relevant to him was in fact directly relevant to him. He was asking about the creek source, Ferris told her, whether it was on private land or public range, whether there were any active disputes about it. Cordelia sat very still. What did anyone tell him? Byrne at the feed store said he didn't know, but Mrs. Ferris was there. Ferris paused. She talked to him for a while. Cordelia closed her eyes briefly, opened them. Thank you, Ferris. She went to find Bastian. He was in the barn going through the winter supply inventory, with the methodical patience he applied to everything, not fast, not showy, just steady and complete. He looked up when she came in and read her face before she said anything. What happened, he said. She told him about Voss, about the water rights questions, about Adele Ferris and the feed store conversation. Bastian set down the inventory sheet. He stood for a moment looking at nothing in particular, the way he did when he was thinking through something with several layers to it. The creek source is on your property, he said. Northwestern Ridge. We passed within half a mile of it on the fence ride. Yes. Is it documented, the water rights? The original deed includes riparian rights along the entire creek line. But she stopped. But what? The deed is 40 years old. The language on water rights in 40-year-old deeds in this territory is, she pressed her lips together. Harlan Peck has told me twice that I should have it re-registered under the current county water authority framework. I haven't done it. Bastian was quiet for a moment. It was not a judgmental silence. It was the silence of a man absorbing a practical problem and beginning to work through it. If someone filed a competing claim on the creek source before you re-registered, they would have the advantage of the current framework, she said. Yes, and the 3 downstream operations would lose water access, which means they'd have to negotiate with whoever held the claim. She looked at him, or with whoever was backing whoever held the claim. The barn was quiet, except for the sound of cattle moving in the outer pen, and the wind working at the roof boards. "Draycott," Bastian said. "I don't know that. You think it." She did think it. But thinking something and knowing it were different standards, and she had learned the cost of operating on the wrong one. "I need to talk to Peck," she said. "Today if I can get a message to him." "I'll ride to town," Bastian said. He was already reaching for his coat. "I can send Ferris." "Ferris doesn't know what questions to ask Peck if he's not there." He pulled his coat on. "I do." She looked at him for a moment. There was something different in how he was standing, not tense exactly, but coiled in a way that hadn't been there 30 days ago. Like a man who has spent a long time bracing for things to fall apart and has only recently considered the possibility that he might be allowed to push back instead. "Be careful what you say to people in town," she said. "Voss will still be there, and anything you say will get back to whoever sent him." "I know how small towns work," he said. "I know you do. I'm saying it anyway." He looked at her, and something in his expression shifted, not softened exactly, but adjusted. The way a thing adjusts when it recognizes that what it's being given is not criticism but concern. "I'll be careful," he said. He rode out within 20 minutes. Merrin was at the dining table with the Silver Briar account ledger when Cordelia came back inside. This was not unusual anymore. Cordelia had been sitting with her for an hour each afternoon over the past week, walking her through the structure of ranch accounts, the way you teach someone a language by using it in context rather than explaining the grammar first. Merrin had a way of asking questions that was unusual for a 12-year-old, and possibly unusual for most adults. She waited until she understood what she was asking before she asked it, which meant her questions were specific, and the answers to them actually stuck. Today, though, she wasn't going through the ledger. She was sitting with it closed in front of her, and she looked up when Cordelia came in with an expression that said she'd heard the conversation in the barn, or enough of it. Cordelia sat down across from her. "How much did you hear?" "Enough," Merrin said. Not with defiance, just the plain direct way she said things. "Someone wants your water. Someone is asking questions about our water rights." "That's not the same thing yet. But it could be. It could be." Merrin looked at the closed ledger. "If someone took the water rights, the downstream people, they'd have to pay for it? For the water? Or do without? Which would likely end their operations. So it's not just about you," Merrin said. "It's about all of them, too." Cordelia looked at the girl, 12 years old, thinking in systems when most people her age were thinking in individual pieces. "That's right," she said. "Then they have a reason to fight it too," Merrin said. "The downstream people. If someone filed a claim, they'd have standing to contest it. Wouldn't they?" Cordelia sat back. She hadn't thought about it from that angle. Or rather, she had, but not with the clarity this 12-year-old had just laid it out. If the three downstream operations, the Paris family, the Holbrook brothers, the small settlement irrigation channel at the south end of the valley, all had interest in the creek's established water flow, then any competing claim on the source would face challenge, not just from Silver Briar, but from everyone downstream. "You'd make a good attorney," Cordelia said. Merrin's expression shifted fractionally, not quite a smile, but something adjacent to it. "I'd rather do what you do. Own the thing." Cordelia looked at her for a long moment. "That takes different work." "I know," Merrin said. "I'm already starting." Bastian was back before dark. He'd found Peck at his office, delivered Cordelia's message, and waited while Peck looked up the current water rights registration framework for the county and compared it against what he knew of Silver Briar's original deed. The news was not as bad as it could have been, and considerably worse than Cordelia would have preferred. "Peck says the original deed holds," Bastian told her. They were in the ranch office, the one room in the house that had always felt to Bastian like the center of things, not the kitchen, where the daily life happened, but this room with the filing cabinet and the desk and the framed survey map on the wall. The riparian rights language is old, but it's clear. Anyone who filed a competing claim would be filing against an established deed. "But," Cordelia said, "there was always a but in these conversations. But the County Water Authority hasn't got Silver Briar in their current registry because the deed predates the authority's formation by 20 years, which means you're not in their system, which means if someone filed a new claim, the authority might process it without knowing there was a prior claim." Peck said it's unlikely but not impossible, and unlikely isn't the same as protected. He pulled out a folded paper from his coat pocket notes he'd taken in Peck's office, in his cramped, precise handwriting. "He wants to file for re-registration immediately. He says he can have the paperwork at the authority office within 4 days if you give him the deed today. I'll get it now, she said, and went to the filing cabinet. There's something else, Bastian said. She stopped with her hand on the cabinet, turned. Voss isn't staying at the boarding house, he said. He's staying at the Ferris property. Cordelia looked at him steadily. Adele Ferris is housing him. Her husband is. I heard it from 2 people independently without asking directly. He paused. And Jared Ferris had business dealings with Draycott. Dry goods supply to the ranch. For the past 3 years, I saw the accounts when I went through the ledger. She turned back to the filing cabinet, found the deed folder, pulled it out, and stood with it in her hands for a moment, not opening it, just holding it. So it is Draycott, she said. I think Draycott is part of it, but I don't think he's the main part. He looked at the survey map on the wall, the one that showed Silver Briar's boundaries, the creek line running through the southwest, the ridge where the source sat. A foreman who got fired and wants revenge doesn't usually go straight to water rights. That takes money and legal contacts. That takes someone who already had an interest in the creek before Draycott came to them. She turned and looked at the map too, followed the creek line with her eyes from the ridge, source down through her property and on south. The creek serves about 1,200 acres of active operations downstream. Yes. And if someone controlled the source, they'd control a significant portion of what those operations can do. She set the deed on the desk. Draycott didn't think of this. Someone told him about the water, or he told someone who knew what to do with the information. Bastian nodded. That's what I think. She opened the deed and started going through it for the relevant section. Her hands were steady, which was not the same as saying she wasn't angry. She was angry, specifically and precisely angry, the kind that comes from recognizing that a problem you thought you had a handle on has revealed itself to be larger and differently shaped than you understood. She had dealt with Draycott's theft and had documented it, and had handed the documentation to the proper authority, and had believed with some justification that the worst of it was behind her. What she was understanding now was that the theft of cattle might have been the beginning rather than the whole. That Draycott, or whoever was working with Draycott, had been looking at Silver Briar not just as a payroll to skim, but as a property with specific vulnerabilities that could be leveraged if the right circumstances were created. She found the water rights section. Read it once, carefully. The language says continuous and established flow from the source at the northwestern ridge, including all tributaries thereof. Peck can work with that. He seemed confident, Bastian said. He usually does. She paused. That's not always the same as being right, but in this case I think he is. She closed the deed. I need you to do something difficult. He looked at her. I need you to go talk to the Paris family and the Holbrook brothers. Explain the situation. Tell them that if someone files a competing water claim, they have standing to object, but only if they move quickly and together. I can't approach them myself without it looking like Silver Briar is building a coalition around my interests instead of theirs. But it is your interests, he said. It's all of our interests. That's the point. But it needs to come from someone who isn't me. She met his eyes. They know you. You've been at the feed store, the post office. You've talked to the Holbrook brothers about their eastern fence, I know you have. He'd helped them with a fence section 2 weeks ago, on his own time on a Saturday when Silver Briar's work was caught up. He hadn't mentioned it to Cordelia. She'd heard about it from Ferris, who'd heard about it from one of the Holbrook hands. He looked at the map. If I go to them and it gets back to Voss Mayence, then Voss knows the downstream operations are aware of the situation, which is itself a deterrent. She paused. Go tomorrow morning. Be direct. Don't speculate about who's behind it. Just give them the facts about the creek and what a new claim would mean for their water. He was quiet for a moment. Then all right. She handed him the deed. Take this to Peck tonight. I'll write him a note. He took it from her, and their hands were close enough that she noticed, without intending to, the particular roughness of his fingers, the kind that comes from decades of wire and leather and cold mornings. She was not a woman who thought about hands much. She noticed it anyway. The night was cold enough to see ice forming on the water trough edges by morning, and Merrin woke before Bastian did. She had always woken early. Her mother had been the same way up before the household, moving quietly through the pre-dawn dark, as though the stillness of an unstarted day had a quality to it worth getting up for. Merrin didn't have the words for what she was looking for in those early hours. She just knew that the first hour of the morning, before anyone else was moving, was when she thought most clearly. She dressed without waking Posy and went out to the yard and stood in the dark and looked at the ranch. Silver Briar was different at this hour. Not soft or harder, if anything, stripped of the activity that made it look like what it was, and reduced to its essentials, the shapes of the barn and the main house against the slightly lighter dark of the sky, the sound of cattle settling in the outer pen, the distant creak of the north fence in the wind. She had stood in enough early mornings at enough different properties to have a sense of what a place was when it thought no one was watching, and what Silver Briar was, at this hour, was solid. That was the word she kept coming back to. Solid. The bunkhouse door opened behind her, and Ferris came out, saw her, and stopped. "Miss Merrin," he said. He was always slightly uncertain about what to call her. Her age made Miss feel strange, but her bearing made dropping the formality feel stranger. "Morning," she said. He came and stood near her. They looked at the ranch together for a moment in the comfortable way of two people who both happened to prefer the morning. "Your dad rode out last night," he said. "I know." To the attorney. "Everything okay?" She thought about what to tell him. Ferris was not a complicated person. He was 23 years old and worked hard, and was learning to pay attention to things beyond the immediate task in front of him, which was more than you could say for men twice his age. She had decided early on that he was worth being honest with. Someone might try to claim the water rights on the creek source, she said. Ferris was quiet for a moment. "That's bad. It could be. Miss Wrenford is dealing with it. With your dad's help." Merrin considered this. "Yes," she said. Ferris blew out a breath that fogged in the cold air. "I've been on 3 ranches before this one," he said. "Never seen an owner who actually worked it themselves. Not really. Usually the owner owns it and someone else does the doing." He paused. "She does the doing." "She does," Merrin agreed. "So does your father." Merrin didn't answer that. She pulled her coat tighter against the cold and watched the eastern sky begin to separate itself from the darkness in the way it did before actual light came, a subtle distinction of dark. From dark, that was the first rumor of morning. "Do you think we'll stay?" Ferris asked. Then quickly, "Sorry. That's none of my—" "Yes," Merrin said. She said it the way she said things when she had decided they were true, not with certainty about the outcome, but with certainty about what she intended. "We're going to stay." Bastian came back from the Paris property at midday. He came back from the Holbrook brothers by late afternoon. He stopped by the ranch office and stood in the doorway with his hat in his hand, in a way that Cordelia had come to recognize as his post-difficult conversation posture, composed but tired around the edges. "Paris is in," he said. No hesitation. His whole livelihood depends on that creek, and he knows it. He said he'll contact his own attorney today and file a statement of interest with the Water Authority. And the Holbrooks? Complicated. He came in and sat down, which he wouldn't have done 30 days ago without being asked. The older brother Warren, he's concerned, but he doesn't want to be seen opposing whoever's behind the claim if they turn out to have county influence. He's been here long enough to remember what happened to the Cully operation in '84, when they went up against someone with county connections and lost the property inside of a year. What does the younger one think? "Dane thinks Warren is a coward and said so directly in front of me." A pause. They're going to argue about it for a day or two, and then come to an agreement that looks like a compromise, and is actually Dane's position, with some of Warren's language wrapped around it. "How sure are you?" "Fairly," he said. "Warren's afraid of losing." "Dane's more afraid of losing without having tried anything." He looked at the survey map. "They'll file." Cordelia nodded. That was 3 operations now: Silver Briar, Paris, Holbrook, with documented interest in the creek's established flow. The settlement irrigation channel at the south end of the valley was the 4th. She had written to them that morning. "There's something I need to tell you," Bastian said. She looked at him. "When I was at the Holbrook property, Warren mentioned something." He paused. "He said that Voss had already been to see them 2 days ago. Before you knew he was in town." The information settled in the room. "He went to the downstream operations first," she said. "He did. He was offering something. Warren didn't say it directly, but the implication was that whoever Voss represents would allow continued water access to the downstream properties in exchange for their non-opposition to the new claim." He met her eyes. He was trying to buy the silence of the people who would otherwise contest the claim. "Did it work with anyone?" Paris said no. "The Holbrooks hadn't answered yet when Voss came to me." He set his hat on his knee. "The irrigation channel, I don't know. Whoever runs that channel has been struggling financially for 2 years. I've heard it mentioned." Cordelia was quiet for a moment. She was running through the implications if Voss had secured one of the downstream operations cooperation that weakened the coalition of interest against the new claim. Not fatally, but it changed the picture. I need to go see the channel's operators myself, she said. That might look... I know how it might look. I'll go anyway. She stood up. Can you hold things here this afternoon without me? I've been holding things here without you since I arrived, he said, and it came out with a slight edge that surprised them both, and then a slight curve at the corner of his mouth that acknowledged what the edge had meant. She looked at him for a moment. Yes, she said, you have. She got her coat. The settlement irrigation channel was managed by a man named Otto Breyer, who had been running it for 11 years, and who was, as Bastian had said, in the kind of financial difficulty that made offers look like different shapes than they were. She found him at the channel headworks, doing the kind of maintenance work that gets done when you can't afford to pay anyone else to do it. He was a heavy-set man in his early 60s, working with the deliberate economy of someone whose joints had been telling him for years that they had an opinion about all of this. He saw her coming and didn't look pleased, which meant he knew why she was there. Miss Wrenford, he said. He didn't stop working. Otto. She stood at the edge of the channel and let him finish what he was doing before she said anything else. That was something she'd learned from watching Bastian. Some conversations needed a minute of physical work to absorb the fact of them before the words could go in properly. He finished, straightened up with the particular care of someone who had learned, be careful about how fast they straightened up. I expect you heard Voss came to see me, he said. I heard. And I expect you want to know what I told him. Only if you want to tell me. He looked at the channel. The water was running low. It was autumn, but it was running lower than it should have been for the season, which was a sign of how the upstream flow had been managed over the past few years. He offered guaranteed access for the next decade, Breyer said. Fixed rate, in writing. In exchange for? In exchange for not filing any objection to the new claim, and for signing a statement saying the creek source is disputed land, not established property. She was very still. That statement would be false. I know what it would be. Ought I know, he said sharply, and then softer, I know. He rubbed the back of his neck. 11 years I've kept this channel running. 6 families depend on it for irrigation. Last 2 summers, the water's been down 15% from what it should be, and I don't fully know why. And if it goes down another 15 this next summer, I'm going to have 4 of those 6 families coming to me about crops that didn't come in. He looked at her. A 10-year guarantee is not nothing to someone in my position. A 10-year guarantee from someone whose opening position is getting you to sign a false statement is worth exactly as much as you think it is, she said. He looked at her for a long moment. What are you offering? I'm not offering anything, she said. I'm asking you not to sign something false in exchange for security you won't actually get. That's not a business proposition. That's just the truth. He turned and looked at the channel again. If the water rights claim goes through, she said, the fixed rate in that guarantee becomes the rate they set, adjusted for their costs and their interests. Every renewal is a negotiation where they hold the source and you hold nothing. A 10-year guarantee is the bait. What comes after 10 years is the actual arrangement. Breyer was quiet for a long time. The water ran through the channel at its low-season pace. Somewhere up the line a board was loose and making a knocking sound. I'll think about it, he said. I need you to think fast, she said. Peck is filing re-registration on the deed this week. Once that's recorded, the claim becomes considerably harder to pursue. But if someone files before we record, I understand the timing. She nodded. Otto, those 6 families, they're not just your responsibility. They're also going to be better protected by a registered deed on established rights than by a privately negotiated 10-year guarantee from someone who has already shown you their first move is to try to buy your silence. She left him at the channel and rode back to Silver Briar. Draycott came the next morning, not Voss. Not a messenger. Draycott himself, riding up to the front gate on a gray horse with his coat collar turned up, and the particular expression of a man who has made a calculation and decided he's comfortable with the results. Bastian saw him from the barn. He stood in the barn door for a moment, looking at the gate, and then he went to find Cordelia. She came to the front of the house and stood on the porch. Draycott, she said. Not a greeting, Cordelia. He had always used her first name. She had always hated it and had never said so, which was one of the things she'd changed her mind about since he left. You should know, she said. That my attorney has filed your livestock transaction records with the county authority. The findings are public. I know, he said. I came to talk about that. There's nothing to talk about. I think there is. He stayed at the gate, didn't try to come through it, which was notable. I think we could settle the livestock matter quietly if we had a conversation about some other arrangements. What arrangements? The creek rights. He said it plainly, without pretense, which was the thing she'd always found strangest about Draycott when he decided to be direct. He was very direct, and it made you briefly forget what he was being direct in service of. There are people interested in formalizing the water access situation in this valley. Good people with real capital who want to invest in the territory's water infrastructure. If Silver Briar were willing to participate in that arrangement. No, she said. You haven't heard the terms. I don't need to. The opening move in this arrangement was sending Voss to buy the silence of the downstream operations. I've heard enough of the terms. Something shifted behind his eyes just slightly, a recalibration. The cattle matter could go away, he said. That's a significant benefit for you. A formal dispute costs time, attorneys, and reputation. It costs your reputation, Hollis. Not mine. It costs the ranch's reputation, he said. Whatever you think of me, a livestock fraud finding attached to Silver Briar's name is going to follow it into every cattle market in the territory for years. Buyers hear it and wonder. That's the truth whether you like it or not. She stood with that for a moment. He wasn't entirely wrong about the reputational dimension. He was right that markets were moved by rumor as much as by fact, and that a fraud finding even one that named him and not the ranch would create a shadow that some buyers would see. Bastian came and stood beside her on the porch. He didn't say anything. He just stood there, which was its own kind of statement. Draycott looked at him. You're still here, he said. Looks like, Bastian said. Something moved across Draycott's face, not quite contempt, but the particular expression of a man who has placed his bet and is beginning to feel uncertain about the odds. You've made yourself comfortable, he said, given the circumstances. Given the circumstances, Bastian agreed, in the tone of a man who is agreeing with the words, and not one thing behind them. Draycott looked back at Cordelia. The offer stands for a week. After that, the water rights situation moves forward without your participation. And when it does, you're going to wish you'd been part of the conversation. He turned his horse and rode out. Cordelia stood on the porch and watched him go until he cleared the road bend and disappeared behind the cottonwoods. Then she looked at the space where he'd been for a moment longer. He's not the money, she said. No, Bastian agreed. He's not. He's the face they put on the conversation so that whoever the money is doesn't appear until they have to. Yes, she turned and went inside. He followed. At the desk, she sat down and picked up a pen and began a letter to Harlan Peck, laying out everything Draycott had said as precisely as she could remember it. She wrote for 20 minutes without stopping. When she finished, she read it back, corrected 2 sentences, folded it, and sealed it. I'm going to need you to ride to town again, she said. I'll go now, he said. She handed him the letter. He took it and turned to leave, and she said his name, just his name, nothing after it. He turned. He came here because he's running out of time, she said. He knew about the re-registration filing. Someone at the authority told him, or someone at Peck's office, or Voss found out some other way. They knew. And instead of accelerating their own timeline, Draycott came here to try to get me to stop. She met his eyes. People don't try to negotiate a stop when they're winning. Bastian held the letter and looked at her. No, he said. They don't. She turned back to her desk. He went out the door. And in the small sheltered pen at the corner of the yard, Posy was crouching beside the calf that had stopped limping and was now following her everywhere. And she was telling it something in her low, unhurried voice, and the animal stood with its chin nearly resting on her shoulder and its eyes half closed in the specific piece of a creature that has decided, completely and without reservation, that it is exactly where it belongs. Peck filed the re-registration on a Wednesday morning, and by Wednesday afternoon, the county water authority had stamped it received and entered it into their current registry, with a file number that would now appear ahead of any competing claim in the queue. It was not a victory exactly. It was the closing of a door before someone else could walk through it, which is a different thing, less satisfying, more practical, and considerably more important. Cordelia received the confirmation by return rider on Thursday. She read it at the kitchen table, set it down, and went to find Bastian. He was in the north pasture checking on the recovered cattle all 59 of them now redocumented and integrated back into Silver Briar's registered herd, carrying new authority-stamped tags that superseded the altered ones. He had made a habit of walking this section in the early afternoon, not because it required daily attention, but because he believed, with the pragmatic conviction of a man who had seen neglect do its quiet damage on too many operations, that the things most recently recovered needed the most consistent watching. She came up beside him, at the fence rail. He looked at the paper she was holding. "It's recorded," she said. He took it, read it, handed it back. "Good. Peck says any claim Voss files now gets reviewed against the established prior right. We're in the registry. They're not. What does that mean for the timeline? It means whoever is behind this has to decide whether to continue with a claim that will be publicly contested by an established deed holder and 3 downstream operations, or cut their losses." She folded the paper. "Peck thinks they'll cut their losses. He says the legal cost of fighting a registered prior right in this county is higher than whatever the water access is worth to them commercially." Bastian looked at the cattle in the north pasture. They were settled, moving the way well-managed cattle move, without the low-level restlessness that comes from inconsistent feeding or inadequate space. "Peck could be wrong," he said. "He could be. He usually isn't about the economics of a legal fight." She paused. "But we'll know more when Voss either files or doesn't. And Draycott? The Livestock Authority is pursuing restitution. Peck says Draycott has retained his own attorney, which means he's preparing to contest the findings rather than settle." She said it without particular emotion, the way she said things she'd already absorbed and set aside the worst part of. That could take a year. Maybe 2. Bastian was quiet for a moment. One of the cattle near the fence shifted and looked at them with the placid, slightly accusing gaze that cattle have when they notice they're being observed. 2 years, he said. "I know. That's a long time to have it unresolved." "It is." She looked at him sideways. "Does that change anything for you?" He turned his head and looked at her directly. It was one of the things she'd come to understand about him. He didn't look away from questions he considered fair, even when they were uncomfortable ones. "No," he said, "it doesn't." She nodded and looked back at the pasture. "Good," she said, "because I have a different conversation I need to have with you, and I'd rather have it while things are still uncertain than wait until they're resolved and have it look like I'm reacting to the outcome." He waited. "Your contract is for ranch manager," she said. "The wage we agreed on reflects that." "It does," he said carefully, because he could hear that she was building toward something and he didn't know what it was yet. Silver Briar made a profit last year despite losing 59 head to Draycott's scheme. She said it plainly, without the pride that a lesser person might have put into it. "With the herd restored and the grazing rotation corrected, I expect this year will be considerably better. And I expect that's partly because of work you've done." "It's your ranch," he said. "It is," she agreed. "Which means I get to decide what the work is worth." She turned to face him fully. "I want to restructure the contract. Add a profit share 5% of the annual net, paid at the end of each fiscal year, in addition to the base wage." He looked at her for a moment. She could see him calculating not the money exactly, but what the offer meant, what accepting it would mean, what the distance was between a ranch hand with a fixed wage and a man with a stake in the outcome. "That's a significant offer," he said. "It's a fair one. You'd be the first person I've employed at Silver Briar who I'd make it to." "Why?" She thought about how to answer that honestly, without saying more than she intended to. "Because you think about this land the way I do," she said finally. "Not as a job, as a thing worth protecting for its own sake. That kind of thinking is worth more than wages can fully account for." He turned back to look at the north pasture. The afternoon light had gone flat and gray, the particular light of late autumn in Wyoming that made everything look like it was being preserved rather than lived in. "I'll need to think about it," he said. She had expected that. "Take whatever time you need." She walked back toward the house, and he stayed at the fence. And neither of them said anything else, and that was fine. Otto Briar sent word 3 days after Cordelia's visit to the channel. The message came through the mail rider, a single sheet in Briar's cramped, effortful handwriting, the writing of a man who doesn't do it often and takes it seriously when he does. It said, "I will not sign Voss's statement. I am contacting the Water Authority directly about the channel's established use. Thank you for the conversation." Cordelia read it twice and set it on the desk beside the re-registration confirmation. Merrin was at the table, doing account work she had progressed in the past 2 weeks, from understanding the structure of the ledger to actually running reconciliations on the monthly figures, cross-checking Cordelia's entries against the purchase and sale receipts. With the careful, unhurried attention she applied to everything she considered worth doing right. "Briar's in," Cordelia said. Merrin didn't look up from the column she was adding. "All 4 downstream operations now?" "Yes." Then whoever filed a claim would face opposition from 5 parties with documented prior interest. She made a small mark in the margin. "That's not a legal fight. That's a disaster." Cordelia sat down across from her, watched her work for a moment. "How did you know about Briar?" "Dad told me. He tells me things he thinks I should understand about how the ranch works." A pause, pencil still moving. "He didn't used to do that. At other places." "What changed?" Merrin looked up then. "You asked him to go to the Paris family in the Holbrooks. He told me about it before he went." He said. She paused, choosing the words carefully in the way she always did. "He said that decisions on a ranch affect everyone on it, and that if I was going to be on this ranch, I should understand what decisions were being made." Cordelia looked at the girl across the table, 12 years old, doing account reconciliations, listening to her father talk about ranch management and storing it alongside livestock tag numbers and ledger entries in whatever the internal mechanism was that let her recall all of it with that particular, unhurried precision. "He's right," Cordelia said. Merrin went back to the column. "I know he is." A small silence opened up between them, not awkward, just the natural space between 2 people who are both working and comfortable with the fact. "Miss Wrenford," Merrin said without looking up. The account for the lumber supplier for the fence repair materials. It's entered twice. Different amounts." Cordelia straightened. "Show me." Merrin turned the ledger and pointed. There they were 2 entries for the same supplier, 12 days apart, one for the correct amount and one for $60 more than the invoice she had on file. "Where's the invoice?" Merrin asked. Cordelia went to the filing cabinet and found the lumber folder. 1 invoice. The correct amount. She brought it back and set it beside the ledger, and they both looked at the double entry. "Draycott," Cordelia said. "Has to be. The second entry date is from before he left." Merrin tapped the entry with the end of her pencil. "He was skimming operational expenses too, not just cattle." Cordelia sat down. She felt the specific tiredness of someone who has been finding the edges of a problem and keeps discovering that the edges are farther out than they thought. "How far back did you go?" 3 months. I can go further." "Go further." Merrin turned back to the ledger without a word and started going backward through the entries with the focused expression she wore when she was doing something that required more than mechanical attention. Cordelia sat with the duplicate entry in front of her and thought about how a man who had managed to steal 59 cattle over 8 months without anyone noticing had probably not limited himself to cattle, and about how much it was going to cost to find out how far back the smaller schemes went, and about how 12-year-old girls with good memories were, in this specific moment in time, worth considerably more than their weight in attorneys. Bastian came to her office that evening. He knocked this time, which he hadn't always done, and waited until she said to come in. He stood just inside the door with his hat in his hand, the posture she'd seen enough times now to know what it meant. "I've thought about the offer," he said. "Sit down," she said. He sat. She waited. "I want to accept it," he said. "But I want to change one thing." She kept her expression even. "Tell me. The 5%, I want half of it set aside separately. Not paid to me directly. Put into an account under Merrin and Posy's names. For their use when they're older." Cordelia looked at him for a moment. The lamp on the desk threw light at a low angle that caught the lines in his face, the ones at the corners of his eyes, the one across his forehead that hadn't been there when he was 25. He wasn't looking at her with any particular expression, just waiting the way he always waited. "Why?" she said. "Because if something happens to me, the wage dies with the contract. But a share in the ranch's success held in an account that belongs to them." He stopped, started again. "They've lived their whole lives with everything conditional on what I could manage. I want to give them something that isn't." She held his eyes across the desk. This man who had signed a contract without asking for more, who had ridden to neighboring properties on her behalf without complaint, who had found her missing cattle in 6 days and her falsified expense accounts through his 12-year-old daughter, and had still framed every significant decision in terms of what it meant for 2 girls who had spent 3 years keeping their belongings packed. All right, she said. I'll have Peck structure it that way. He nodded, put his hat back on, started to rise. Bastian, she said. He stopped. She had not planned to say this now. She had not planned to say it in any particular way, or at any particular time, because she was not a woman who planned conversations that required her to be uncertain in front of someone else. But it was said now, or at least his name was said, and he was looking at her, and she had learned enough about herself in the past 2 months to know that not saying things didn't make them less true. What you just asked for, she said. For your daughters. That is not the thing a man asks for when he's planning to leave. A silence. No, he said. It's not good, she said. I want to know that we understand each other on that point. He looked at her with an expression she had seen only a few times, something underneath the steadiness, something that the steadiness was working to contain, without being entirely successful. We understand each other, he said. He left. She turned back to her desk and sat for a moment looking at nothing in particular, and then picked up her pen and went back to work, which was the only reliable cure she'd ever found for the particular restlessness of wanting a thing, and not being sure yet what to do about it. Voss left Larkspur Crossing on a Friday. Cordelia heard it from Ferris, who had been in town for ranch supplies, and had noticed the absence of Voss's horse at the Ferris property, and had thought to confirm it at the boarding house, where the proprietor confirmed that a man matching Voss's description had settled his room charge the previous evening and ridden south. No competing water rights claim had been filed. The window Peck had identified for the most dangerous period, the 2 weeks between Draycott's visit, and the point at which contesting Silver Briar's registered deed would become economically ruinous, had closed without incident. When Bastian told Cordelia that Voss was gone, she was at the barn checking on the roan cow that Posy had flagged weeks ago. The cow was well. She had been switched to a different feed mix that agreed with her considerably better, and she had the relaxed posture of an animal that has stopped fighting against something and settled back into its natural state. It's over, Cordelia said. The water piece is over, Bastian said. The livestock matter still has... I know. I meant this part. She looked at the cow for a moment. Whoever was behind Voss decided the cost was too high, which means we won't hear from them directly again. They might find another angle. They might. But it'll take time to set up. And by then, the re-registration will be fully processed and public, and the downstream coalition will be on record. She looked at him. Sometimes winning is just making yourself too expensive to fight. It's not satisfying, but it holds. He considered that. It holds, he agreed. She looked at the roan cow for another moment. Posy caught this one early, she said. The feed issue. She did. If she'd been left to figure it out on her own, the animal would have been declining for another month before anyone noticed in the course of normal management. She paused. I want to formalize what she does with the weaker animals. Not as employment, she's 7. I'm not putting a 7-year-old on payroll, but as a recognized role, with a small pen space dedicated to it, proper supplies, and Ferris assigned to assist her when she needs it. Bastian looked at her. She has a skill, Cordelia said. The kind that's rare and that gets wasted when it doesn't have a proper channel. I don't want it wasted. She paused. She should know that what she does here matters. Not because it's helpful to have her occupied, but because it actually matters. He was quiet for long enough that she wondered if she'd said something wrong. Then, her mother used to say that the worst thing you can do to a child with a gift is let them think it's just a habit. She looked at him. He was looking at the cow. I'll talk to Ferris, she said, and I'll talk to Posy. You tell me if you think I'm approaching it wrong. You won't approach it wrong, he said. She wasn't sure she agreed with that, but she let it stand. The Holbrooks filed their statement of interest with the Water Authority on a Monday. Warren had added 3 paragraphs of qualifying language that meant almost nothing, and that Dane had apparently agreed to include in exchange for Warren's signature, which made the document slightly longer and considerably less elegant than it needed to be, but which achieved the essential purpose. Paris had filed the previous week. Peck sent Cordelia confirmation of both filings with a brief note that said the coalition of downstream opposition was now fully on record, and that he considered the water rights matter closed, barring extraordinary circumstances. He billed her for 14 hours of attorney time, which was considerably less than she had expected, and which she paid the following day, without requesting itemization. Merrin, working backward through the expense ledger, found 11 more duplicate or inflated entries across a period of 7 months. The total discrepancy came to $432, not an enormous sum in isolation, but significant when added to the cattle losses, and considered as part of a consistent pattern of extraction that had been running in parallel with the larger scheme. She presented her findings to Cordelia and Bastian together at the kitchen table, with the ledger open and a separate sheet showing each discrepancy cross-referenced against the corresponding invoice where one existed. Her handwriting on the reference sheet was small and precise, each entry numbered, the total at the bottom underlined twice. Bastian looked at the sheet for a moment, then at his daughter. "When did you do all of this?" he asked. "Evenings," she said. "After lessons. That's 5 hours of work at least." 7, she said without apology. Some of the filing was disorganized. "I had to resort it." Cordelia was looking at the reference sheet, with an expression Merrin couldn't fully read, not displeasure, but something more complicated than simple approval. "You resorted the filing?" she said. "It was sorted by date of entry, not by supplier," Merrin said. "That makes it easy to enter things in order, but hard to catch patterns across suppliers. I sorted it by supplier first, then by date within each supplier. The duplicates showed up in about 20 minutes after that." Cordelia set down the sheet. "Merrin," she said, "ma'am, how would you like to be in charge of maintaining the account filing system going forward? With a proper review schedule." Merrin looked at Bastian once, briefly, and then back at Cordelia. "I'd like that," she said. "I'll pay you," Cordelia said. "Not wages, you're 12, and this isn't full employment, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. But there'll be a learning stipend. Something that acknowledges that what you do here is real work, not a hobby." Bastian opened his mouth, and Cordelia looked at him, and he closed it again, which was something that had become possible between them over the past weeks, the communication of things through expression and implication that previously had required words. "All right," he said, not agreeing exactly, more like acknowledging that this was happening and that he didn't have a better argument. Merrin looked at the reference sheet she'd made. Something in her posture had shifted barely perceptibly, but Bastian saw it, and Cordelia saw it too. The slight straightening that happens when a person has been carrying something they weren't sure would be acknowledged and has just been told that it was. "I'll need more ledger storage," she said practically. "The current system only goes back 3 years. If there are patterns in the expense accounts before that, I'll need the older files." Cordelia stood and went to the cabinet by the far wall and opened the bottom drawer and pulled out a leather-bound folder that was thick with older papers. She set it on the table in front of Merrin. 5 years, she said. "Start with that." The first snow came in the 3rd week of November. It arrived the way first snows always do overnight, without theatrical warning, so that you went to bed with a cold sky and woke to a landscape that had been reorganized while you weren't watching. The northern pasture held it longest, the flat sections accumulating 3 inches while the ridge slopes shed most of it into the hollow below. Bastian was up before the snow had fully stopped, which was characteristic, and had the winter feeding rotation underway before any of the other hands had finished their boots. Cutter appeared at the barn door at 5:20 and looked at the situation, and then looked at Bastian with the expression of a man who is revising an opinion he's been holding for a while and would prefer not to do so publicly. "East section first," Bastian said, not to make a point, just because it was the right order. "I know," Cutter said. He got his coat. The morning's work was hard and unglamorous in the way winter ranch work always is: cold hands, heavy equipment, animals that were restless from the change in weather and needed managing with patience rather than force. Bastian worked through it with the same steady rhythm he applied to everything, and by mid-morning the feeding rotation was complete and the water sources were cleared of ice, and 3 of the hands had warmed up enough to be human again. Ferris found Bastian at the barn after the morning work was done. He had the look of someone who has been thinking about something for a while and has finally decided to say it. "Can I ask you something?" Ferris said. "Go ahead." That first week, when Draycott was saying things in town about the ledger, he paused. "You almost left, didn't you?" Bastian looked at him for a moment. Ferris was 23, earnest in the particular way of people who are still young enough to believe that honesty is always the right choice, and haven't yet learned when it isn't. "Almost," Bastian said. "Why didn't you?" He thought about the gate, about the word 30 days, said not as a limit but as a promise, about Merrin putting her books on the shelf instead of keeping them in the saddlebag. "Because my daughter's unpacked," he said. Ferris thought about that for a moment. "That's a good reason," he said. "It's the only one that mattered." Ferris nodded and went to see to his afternoon work, and Bastian stood in the barn door and looked at the snow on the north pasture, which was clean and white and would be cut through with cattle tracks by evening and would look like something lived in rather than preserved, and that was the better thing. The conversation Cordelia didn't expect came from Cutter. He found her at the fence line on the south side, where a post had heaved in the freeze and needed resetting a two-person job that she'd intended to ask one of the hands about, and had ended up starting herself in the meantime, which was a habit she had, and knew was a habit and hadn't fully corrected. Cutter took the post driver from her without asking and reset the post in 4 strikes, which was 2 fewer than it had taken her and considerably more vertical. Hired him permanent, he said, not a question. I did. He tamped the bass. Good. She waited, because Cutter approaching a conversation in 3-word segments usually meant there was more coming. Those girls, he said. What about them? Posy fixed the calf. He said it like a fact that had been sitting somewhere needing to be acknowledged. Merrin found the duplicate accounts. Ferris told me. That's right. Kids don't do that, he said. Not just because they're smart, because someone raised them that way. He set the post driver down. Their father raised them that way. Cordelia looked at the reset post. It was well done, solidly set, properly vertical. He did, she said. Cutter picked up his tools. I was wrong about him, he said. At the start. I know. Wanted to say it. I appreciate it, Cutter. He walked back toward the barn with the post driver over his shoulder, and that was Cutter's version of a long conversation, and it was enough. The thing Cordelia hadn't said to Bastian, the thing she'd been not saying for several weeks with increasing effort, was that she looked forward to seeing him in the morning. Not in a way she was embarrassed about. In the plain, unglamorous way you look forward to something that has become part of the reliable structure of your day, a specific kind of reliability that is different from habit, different from convenience, and that you notice most when it's absent. She noticed it on the one day he rode out to the Paris property alone and didn't come back until after dark. She noticed the specific quality of the morning without him, in it not worse in any particular way, just differently shaped, the way a room feels different after you've rearranged it, and you keep reaching for something in the place where it used to be. She didn't say any of this. She was 33 years old and had managed 2,000 acres for 9 years without anyone's company being necessary to her, and she was not going to revise that assessment based on a few months. But she stopped pretending to herself that it wasn't true. The evening he came back from the Paris property, he stopped at the kitchen door she'd left the lamp on, not for any particular reason she intended to admit to, and knocked. Come in, she said. He came in with snow on his coat and the particular tiredness of a man who had ridden in cold for several hours and had done useful work at the end of it. She put coffee in front of him and sat across the table and asked about the Paris situation, and he told her, specifically and without embellishment, everything that had been said. When he was done, she had everything she needed to know about the Paris family's commitment to the Water Rights Coalition. She also had the specific warmth of a man across her kitchen table who looked at her when he talked not through her, not past her, but her, in the way that means the person speaking is considering whether what they're saying is landing where they intend. You're staring at me, he said. I'm listening, she said. He looked at his coffee. You don't usually stare when you're listening. I don't usually have much worth listening to at this hour, she said, which was not the true reason, but was also not entirely false, and he looked at her with the expression of a man who has heard the partial truth in a sentence and is deciding whether to ask about the rest. He didn't ask. He finished his coffee, put on his coat, said good night. At the door he paused the pause she'd learned to expect, because he almost always paused at doors, as though leaving required one additional moment of inventory. Merrin asked me tonight, he said, if she could start coming to the morning fence checks with me. What did you tell her? I said I'd ask you. Tell her yes, Cordelia said, and tell her to wear the heavier coat, the one with the wool lining. It's getting cold out there. He looked at her for a moment with something in his face that he didn't name and she didn't ask about. Then he went out. She sat at the table after he was gone and looked at the lamp and thought about cold mornings and fence lines and a man who paused at doors, and then she got up and blew out the lamp and went to bed. Draycott's attorney sent a formal response to the Livestock Authority's restitution demand in early December. It was, according to Peck, exactly what he'd expected, a document that acknowledged nothing directly, contested the methodology of the independent count, raised questions about the timeline of the ledger alterations without offering a counter-explanation, and generally attempted to introduce enough procedural noise that the matter would take longer than it should. He's buying time, Peck told Cordelia, hoping something changes. A witness becomes unavailable. A record gets misfiled. The authority loses interest in a complicated case. Will any of that happen? Witness-wise, know your documentation is physical, not testimonial. Record-wise. He looked at the copy of Oakes's independent assessment on his desk. Oakes keeps his own copies, and the exchange transaction records are the exchange's own files. I can't see how they'd become unavailable. He paused. As for the authorities' interest, these things do sometimes drag. It's the honest answer. Then we keep the documentation current and we wait, she said. That's about the size of it, yes. She rode back to Silver Briar in the early afternoon through a pale winter sun that gave more light than warmth, and she thought about patience, the specific kind required to maintain a position against someone who is counting on your willingness to sustain discomfort to eventually run out. She was not afraid of discomfort. She had spent 9 years getting up before the sun to run a ranch most people in the territory thought should belong to someone else, meaning someone male. And she had done it through drought years and difficult markets, and a dishonest foreman whose dishonesty she now understood had been more comprehensive than she'd wanted to believe. Patience was not the problem. The problem was the smaller, grittier discomfort of knowing that the resolution was coming and that there was nothing she'd do to accelerate it without doing something she'd regret. She came through the Silver Briar gate in the late afternoon and found Posy in the small sheltered pen with 3 calves, instead of one the calf that had been limping, now fully recovered, and 2 others that Ferris had apparently moved there that morning. Posy was moving between all 3, with the same unhurried, certain steadiness she always brought to animals, and all 3 were calm in a way that animals rarely are in groups when they're newly acquainted. Cordelia stopped her horse and watched. This was the thing that nobody had asked for, and that had turned out to be one of the most useful arrangements on the ranch, a 7-year-old, with a gift that no one had bothered to name as a gift because it didn't look like work. She went and put her horse away and found Bastian at the water trough. The pen, she said. Ferris expanded it yesterday, he said. Added the 2 new ones this morning. He said Posy had been watching them from the fence for 3 days. She's good at that, Cordelia said. She's better than good, Bastian said. He was looking at the pen from a distance, the way parents look at their children when the children can't see them doing it. At the last place we were, there was a man who trained horses. Professional trainer, had a real reputation in the county. He watched her work with a nervous mare for about 10 minutes, and then came and told me my daughter had a gift he'd spent 30 years trying to teach and never fully could. What did you do with that? I didn't do anything. We left 2 weeks later. His jaw tightened fractionally. That's the other reason I wanted to give them something that stays, even if the work doesn't. Because I've watched them leave things behind. Things that were starting to become theirs. He looked away from the pen, back at the water trough, at the practical immediate thing. I don't want to do that anymore. Cordelia stood beside him and looked at nothing in particular for a moment. You're not going to, she said. He looked at her. I mean that as a statement about the ranch's situation, she said carefully. Not as I'm saying the operational position is stable. The contract is solid. The water rights are filed. The livestock case will resolve in our favor. You have every practical reason to believe the situation here is durable. He held her eyes. I know what you mean, he said, and I know what you don't mean. A pause. I appreciate both. She looked away first, which was unusual. She was not generally a person who looked away first from anything. Dinner is at 6, she said. Merrin said she'd help. She's been doing that, he said. Helping with dinner. I know. She's learning to make biscuits. She's not very good at them yet. No, he agreed. They're quite dense. They're getting better. They are, he said, slowly. And they stood there by the water trough in the cold late afternoon light, 2 people not quite saying what they meant, and both of them aware of it, while inside the small sheltered pen, a 7-year-old girl moved between 3 calves with her hands open and her voice low, and the animals followed her like she was the most sensible thing in their immediate world, which, as far as Bastian Crowther could tell, she was. The livestock authorities' formal ruling came on a Tuesday in late February, delivered by a county rider, who handed the envelope to Cordelia at the front gate without ceremony, and turned his horse around before she'd finished signing the receipt. She stood in the cold and opened it there, rather than going inside. because she had learned over 9 years of ranch ownership that bad news didn't improve with a change of location. And if the news was good, she wanted to know it before she'd had to sit with the not knowing any longer. It was good. Not clean, nothing about this had been clean but definitive. The authorities' ruling found Hollis Draycott liable for the removal and fraudulent sale of 51 head of registered cattle from Silver Briar Ranch over a period of 8 months. Restitution was set at the assessed market value of the cattle, plus 10% for fraudulent concealment, to be paid within 90 days. Draycott's registration as a licensed ranch manager in the county was permanently revoked. The ruling noted that the discovery of the scheme had been made possible by the independent livestock count conducted by Tenor Oaks and the internal discrepancy analysis initiated by Silver Briar's current ranch manager. She read that last sentence twice. Then she folded the document, put it in her coat pocket, and walked to the barn to find Bastian. He was where he usually was at this hour at the workbench, going through the winter supply inventory with the methodical patience that had become, over the past several months, one of the reliable rhythms of the place. He looked up when she came in and read her verses before she said anything, which he was good at. "It's done," she said. He set down the inventory sheet. The ruling, full liability, 90 days for restitution. His license is revoked. She paused. "It mentions you by name as the ranch manager whose work initiated the discovery." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind was moving through the gaps in the barn siding, and one of the horses shifted in its stall, and the ordinary sounds of the place went on the way they always did, indifferent to the significance of what was happening inside them. "It's over then," he said. "The legal part," she said. "The actual part was over when you counted the herd on your 6th day." He looked at the workbench. There was something in his face she had learned to read over the winter, the particular expression he had when he was absorbing something that had been uncertain for a long time and was now resolved. And the resolution was requiring him to adjust to a new state of things. He didn't rush adjustments. He made them carefully, the way he made everything. "I want to show you something," he said. She waited. He reached under the workbench and produced the old wooden trunk, the one that had come off the back of the horse on the first day, strapped beside the 2 battered saddlebags. It was sitting flat on the floor, unlocked, the lid closed. "I haven't opened this since November," he said. She looked at it. "Since the contract," he said. "I put it under the bench the day after I signed it, and I haven't touched it." He paused. "Usually I keep it where I can reach it fast. 3 years of sleeping in places where you might need to leave before morning does that to you." The barn was quiet around them. "I want to put it in the cottage," he said. "Properly, in a closet where a trunk belongs, not where I can reach it fast." Cordelia looked at the trunk for a long moment. It was battered and water-stained, and had a rope handle on one end that had been replaced at some point with a leather strap that didn't quite match. It was the most ordinary object she'd ever seen that managed to hold this much weight. "Then put it there," she said. Merrin was the one who found the error in the restitution calculation. She came to Cordelia 3 days after the ruling with the authority document and her own reference sheet beside it, and pointed to a line in the calculation methodology. The authority had used the previous autumn's market rate for cattle of the relevant grade, which was accurate, but they had applied it uniformly across all 51 head, without accounting for the fact that 11 of the removed animals had been breeding stock worth considerably more than standard market rate. "The difference is about $340, Merrin said. "If you contest the valuation for those 11 specifically and provide the breeding documentation, you'd recover the full amount." Cordelia looked at the reference sheet. It was thorough, each of the 11 animals identified by tag number, the breeding registry entry for each, and a separate column showing the difference between standard market rate and documented breeding stock value. At the bottom, the total discrepancy and a note that said, "Source, Silver Briar Breeding Registry, cross-referenced with county livestock valuation tables. Current year." "How long did this take you?" Cordelia asked. 2 evenings, Merrin said. "The breeding registry was already organized. I just had to match the tag numbers to the authorities' list." Cordelia sat back. Merrin was 13 now. Her birthday had come in January, a quiet affair at the kitchen table, with a cake that Posy had helped make and that had listed slightly to one side but had tasted fine. 13 years old, standing at the dining table with a correctly identified $300 error in a legal authority's calculation, waiting to see if the grown woman across from her thought it was worth pursuing. "I'll send this to Peck today," Cordelia said. Merrin gathered her papers with the small, controlled satisfaction of someone who has done a thing and had it recognized and doesn't need more than that. At the door, she paused. "Miss Wrenford," she said. The breeding registry goes back 11 years. Dracott's expense irregularities I found the earliest ones. From when he first started as foreman, she hesitated. They're small at the beginning. Very small. Like he was testing whether anyone would notice. Cordelia looked at her. "I documented everything back to the start," Merrin said. "It's in the ledger room. In case you need it." She left. Cordelia sat with that for a moment, the specific quality of a 13-year-old who did the extra work, not because she was asked, but because she understood why it mattered and had decided that understanding was enough reason. She thought about what Bastian had said months ago, about his daughters beginning to believe Silver Briar might become home, and how that had frightened him more than poverty ever did. She understood that fear better now than she had in October. The thing you're most afraid of losing is the thing that has started to feel real. Spring came the way it does in Wyoming, not gracefully. Not all at once, but in arguments. A warm week followed by a hard freeze. Snow in March that melted in 2 days and left the pastures soft and difficult. The creek running higher than usual through the southwestern corner, which made the water rights registration feel even more practically important than it had in the abstract. Bastian and Cutter walked the full perimeter fence in late March, taking 4 days and sleeping in the field for 2 of them. They came back with a repair list and a different dynamic between them than had existed in October, not warmth exactly, because Cutter didn't operate in warmth, but the specific respect of 2 men who've worked a hard job together in cold conditions and have stopped wasting energy on positions they held before they knew each other. Cordelia noticed it the day they came back. They were at the water trough, Cutter describing a fence section in the southeast corner that needed more than repair, that needed full replacement, and Bastian listening without interrupting, making notes, asking one question when Cutter finished. It was entirely unremarkable. It was also, if you'd seen the 2 of them in the first week of October, nearly unrecognizable. That was the thing about time on a ranch. It compressed some things and stretched others, but it was reliable in one regard. It showed you what people were made of, given enough of it. Ferris had become, over the winter, something between a hand and an assistant ranch manager, without anyone formally making that designation. He managed the morning feeding rotation without supervision, had begun keeping his own notes on animal health in the outer pens, and had developed with Posy a working partnership that functioned with the efficiency of people who have divided a responsibility by natural aptitude and stopped arguing about who does what. Posy's small sheltered pen had grown. By spring it had a proper roof over one section, a separate feeding station, and enough space for 6 animals. It was not an official ranch operation. Cordelia had been careful about that, had made sure that Posy understood the distinction between her work there and the ranch's commercial functions. But it was recognized, in the particular way that things get recognized on a working ranch, by the fact that resources went to it, that people referred to it in planning conversations, that Ferris included it in his morning notes without being asked. "She's going to do something real with this," Ferris told Bastian one evening in March, watching Posy from the barn door. "I know," Bastian said. "I mean professionally, when she's older. Someone's going to pay her to know what she knows." Bastian looked at his younger daughter, 8 years old now, moving through the sheltered pen with 3 recovering concavs and 1 older sheep that had developed a joint problem and had come to her by way of Ferris deciding that if there was a better option than the usual management approach, this was probably it. "Yes," he said. "Someone will." Peck's supplemental filing on the breeding stock valuation was accepted by the authority in April. Dracott's attorney contested it, a matter of course, because contesting things as a matter of course was what they had decided to do at every stage of this process. The authority reviewed the breeding registry documentation that Merrin had compiled and found it sufficient. The restitution amount was revised upward by $342. It was not, in the context of the full settlement, a large sum. It was also not the point. The point was that the documentation was correct, and the ruling was wrong, and the wrong thing had been fixed, because a 13-year-old girl had spent 2 evenings cross-referencing tag numbers against a registry. Cordelia sent the revised ruling to Bastian with a note that said only, "Merrin was right. CW," he showed it to Merrin. She read it once, folded it, and put it in the tin box that had always held her mother's hairpins. Bastian saw that and didn't say anything. Some moments don't need commentary. They just need to be seen. The question Bastian had been not asking for several months came out on a May evening when the cottonwoods along the creek had come into full leaf and the light was doing what it does in Wyoming in late spring, holding long past. When it should, as if the day is reluctant to end. They were at the fence on the western side, the one that ran along the creek, where Bastian had been replacing the posts that had heaved in the winter freeze. He had finished the last post and was tamping the base, and Cordelia was sitting on the fence rail watching, which she had developed a habit of doing when he was doing close focus work, not supervising, just present, the way people are present when they're comfortable enough not to need a reason. He tamped the last strike, set down the tamper, stood up. He didn't turn around immediately. He looked at the post for a moment, then at the creek, then at the cottonwoods, and she watched him work through whatever he was working through with the patience she'd learned was required. When he turned, his expression was the open one, not the careful, composed face he wore for most things, but the one that appeared occasionally, usually in the evenings, usually when he thought she wasn't looking directly at him. "I need to ask you something," he said. "All right," she said. He came and stood in front of her. She was on the fence rail, which put them at roughly the same height, which she suspected was not an accident. He had his hat in his hands in the way he always held it when he was saying something serious. "I'm not asking because of the ranch," he said. "I'm not asking because of the contract or the profit share or because the girls have settled in and it would be convenient. I need you to know that first." "I know that," she said. "Do you?" "Yes," she said. "You've been not asking for 4 months. A man who's asking for convenience reasons doesn't wait 4 months. Something shifted in his expression, the faintest adjustment of a thing that had been held carefully for a long time. "I'm asking because I want to," he said. "Because when I'm not here, I think about being here. And when I am here, I think about whether I have the right to want what I want, which is..." He stopped, tried again. "Which is this, you, this place, all of it together." She looked at him steadily. "I'm not an easy person," he said. "I know that. I get in my head and I go quiet, and I don't always say things when I should. I've spent 3 years being so careful about not making demands that I've probably made the people around me feel like I'm never fully there." He paused. "I'm working on that. I know you are," she said. "And you're not. You don't need this. I'm aware of that. You've run this ranch for 9 years and you've done it with ounce." "Bastian," she said. He stopped. "I know what I need," she said. "I've known what I need for 33 years. The question was never whether I needed it. The question was whether the right person was going to ask." He held her eyes. "Are you asking?" she said. He put his hat down on the fence post beside her. "I'm asking," he said. "Not whether you need me, whether you choose me." She looked at him, this man who had arrived at her gate with 2 daughters and 2 saddlebags, and a wooden trunk, and 15 years of cattle experience, and a way of standing at the threshold of things that she had come to understand was not hesitation but care, who had found her missing cattle in 6 days, and her falsified accounts through patient work, and had locked nothing in except his own intention to do the job right, who had asked for his daughter's future before he asked for anything for himself, and who was standing in front of her, now, with his hat on a fence post and his hands open, and the cottonwoods behind him in full May leaf. "Yes," she said. "I choose you." He reached up and took her hand from the fence rail. Not dramatically, just held it, the way you hold something you've been careful around for a long time and have finally been told you're allowed to hold. They stood there by the creek for a while. The water ran the way it had always run, established and registered and belonging to this land. The cottonwoods moved in the light wind. Somewhere back toward the ranch, Posy was talking to the calves in her low, certain voice, and Merrin was probably at the dining table with a ledger. And Cutter was doing something practical and necessary, and would not want anyone to notice him doing it. Silver Briar went on, the way it always had. Only now it went on differently. They married in September. Cordelia had wanted it quiet, which Bastian had understood to mean small and without theater, which suited him entirely. The ceremony happened under the cottonwoods on a Saturday morning, when the leaves were just beginning to turn, in the presence of Peck, who had offered to act as witness, and Cutter, who appeared in a clean shirt that no one commented on, and Ferris, who had polished his boots, and the Paris family, who had driven out on their own initiative, and who brought a pie that Cordelia thanked them for with sincerity. Merrin stood beside her father. She had pressed her best dress and pulled her hair back, and wore an expression that was the most complicated she'd had in some time, not simple happiness, which she didn't often do, but something more honest. The look of a person who has been carrying a weight for so long that they've forgotten what it feels like not to, and who is only now, in this specific moment, becoming aware that some of the weight has lifted. Posy carried wildflowers. She'd gathered herself from the creek bank that morning, a loose, slightly haphazard bunch that included at least 2 varieties that were technically weeds and that she had decided were beautiful anyway, which was a perfectly sound way to make that determination. When it was done, Cordelia looked at the 2 girls and said simply, "Same house. Same table. Nothing changes except that it's permanent," Posy said. It was already permanent. Bastian looked at his younger daughter. "We stopped packing," Posy said, in the tone of someone explaining something that should have been obvious. "A long time ago. That means it's permanent." Cordelia looked at Bastian. He looked at her, and there was something between them in that moment that was not quite a smile and not quite anything else. Either just the shared recognition of 2 people who have arrived somewhere true and are, for once, not surprised to find the other one there. Before the ceremony, Cordelia had finalized the legal structure she'd been working on with Peck for 2 months. Silver Briar would not pass to Bastian by marriage. That had never been under discussion, and he had never asked for it. He had, in fact, when Peck raised the standard provisions in territorial marriage law that would grant a husband interest in his wife's property, said flatly that he didn't want them applied, which had made Peck pause for a moment, in the way attorneys pause when a client says something they've never heard a client say before. What the legal structure did was this. It established a family trust holding Silver Briar's land and assets, with Cordelia and Bastian as joint managing trustees during their lives. Merrin and Posy were named as remainder beneficiaries with equal shares. The trust allowed either trustee to act on ranch operational matters independently, required both for any sale of land or fundamental change in the ranch's nature, and designated the girls' shares as vested and unconditional, not dependent on continued residence, not conditional on anything except the fact of their being Bastian's daughters and part of this family. Peck had drawn it up with the care he gave to things he thought mattered. When he handed Cordelia the final document, he said, "This is well thought through." "Merrin helped me think through it," Cordelia said. Peck looked at her. "She's 13. I know how old she is." He looked at the document again. "The remainder structure is sophisticated. The unconditional vesting in particular." He paused. "She suggested that?" "She said that belonging somewhere shouldn't be conditional on anything except the fact of belonging, and that the legal structure should reflect that, rather than creating conditions that the belonging then had to satisfy." Cordelia paused. She said it more simply than that, but that was what she meant. Peck was quiet for a moment. "She's going to be formidable," he said. "I know," said Cordelia, "she already is." The months after the wedding were not a transformation. They were a continuation, the same work, the same land, the same daily negotiations between what a ranch demands and what the people running it can give, which is never quite enough and always somehow sufficient. What changed was the texture of the days. Bastian was more present in the house in the evenings, which was partly because he lived there now, and partly because he had been working for a year on the habit of being fully somewhere, instead of half somewhere, with one part of himself already checking exits. He still went quiet sometimes. He still processed things internally before he said them, which could be frustrating when Cordelia needed a quick answer, and he wasn't ready to give one. They disagreed about the breeding program in October, a real disagreement, with actual positions that didn't resolve in an afternoon, and they both said things that were sharper than they'd intended, and then they came back to it 2 days later and worked through it without drama, and arrived at an approach that was neither of theirs exactly, but was better than both. That was the thing about sharing a life with someone you respect. You don't agree all the time. You don't smooth each other's edges off. You stay in the disagreement until it becomes something useful instead of walking away from it. Merrin turned 14 in January and asked Cordelia if she could begin sitting in on the quarterly meetings with the cattle buyers. Not to speak, she was clear that she understood the protocol, that she wasn't asking to be treated as an adult decision-maker before she'd earned it, but to watch, to understand how the business conversations worked from the inside. Cordelia said yes. The first meeting, Merrin sat in the corner with a notebook and said nothing for 2 hours, and afterward she had 8 pages of notes and 2 questions about the pricing methodology that Cordelia answered fully, because they were good questions. The second meeting, she asked one of the questions during the meeting itself addressed to the buyer, politely and precisely, about why the offered rate for breeding stock was lower than the previous quarter when the registry documentation had strengthened. The buyer had looked slightly startled and then had answered her directly, because the question didn't leave room for a non-direct answer, and Cordelia had looked at the table and controlled her expression, and Bastian, who was sitting nearby, had developed a sudden interest in the ceiling. After the buyer left, Cordelia looked at Merrin. "You said you were going to watch." "I was watching," Merrin said. "And then I had a question." Bastian said nothing. He was still looking at somewhere neutral. His jaw had the particular set of a man who is working very hard not to show that he is proud. Posy's sheltered pen became, over the following 2 years, something the Valley's ranchers began to reference, in the way people reference a thing that has established itself, not as a novelty but as a fact of the landscape. If you had a calf that wasn't thriving, if you had an animal that had been through something difficult and wasn't recovering on the standard timeline, the word that went around was that the Wrenford Ranch had a pen for that, managed by a girl who knew what she was doing. Posy was 9, then 10. She didn't seek the recognition. She was doing what she'd always done, being present, in a way that asked nothing of the animals except that they be what they were, and finding that this was, consistently enough. Ferris remained her working partner, which meant that by the time Posy was 10, Ferris had become something considerably more knowledgeable about animal behavior than he'd been when Bastian had arrived. And he occasionally caught himself explaining things to other hands that he'd learned from an 8-year-old and had to decide how to frame that. He usually framed it accurately. It stopped being awkward sometime around the 3rd time. The ranch prospered in the way that careful, unglamorous work produces prosperity not suddenly, not dramatically, but consistently and in a direction. The grazing rotation that Bastian had implemented in the first week produced measurable results by spring. The corrected breeding program, the one that had required 2 days of disagreement to reach, improved the herd quality in ways the buyers noticed within 18 months and priced accordingly. Cordelia and Bastian had their arguments and their silences and their mornings where everything ran smoothly, and their days where nothing did, and their evenings at the kitchen table where the lamp burned low and one of them would say something that the other one would think about for 3 days. It was a life, not a perfect one. The kind where the seams show and the repairs are visible and the whole thing holds anyway, which is the only kind that actually holds. One evening in their second winter, when Merrin was at the table with the account books, and Posy had come in from the pen smelling of hay and cold air, and had fallen asleep in the chair by the stove with her boots still on, Bastian came and stood beside Cordelia at the kitchen counter, and said nothing for a moment, and then said, "I almost didn't come through that gate." She looked at him. "The first day," he said. "I'd been turned away from 2 places before yours. I almost didn't try again. I was thinking about going south, maybe trying Texas, starting somewhere completely different." He looked at the kitchen, the lamp, the sleeping child in the chair, the older one bent over the books. "Merrin was the one who saw your notice." She pointed it out on the board at the post office. She said the notice was written by someone who knew what they needed. How did she know that from a notice? She said the language was specific, that most notices are vague because the person doesn't actually know what they're looking for. He paused. She said this one knew. Cordelia looked at the notice in question, the original, framed now in the ranch office, where it had been hanging since the autumn. Experienced ranch hand sought. Winter through spring. Excellent wages, private bunkhouse, permanent position for the right candidate. She had not thought of it as specific. She had thought of it as practical. "She was right," Bastian said. "You knew what you needed." Cordelia looked at her daughter, her stepdaughter, technically, legally, but the word that came to mind when she thought of Merrin in this moment was not the technical one. "So did she," she said. "Apparently." He looked at her with the expression she knew best, the open one, the one he still wore less often than the careful one, but more often than he had a year ago, and more often still than 2 years ago. "Thank you," he said, "for the gate." She looked back at the lamp, at the sleeping child, at the girl doing the accounts. "Thank you," she said, "for coming through it." Years later, many years later, when Merrin was running Silver Briar's business side, with an efficiency and precision that made visiting buyers sit up a little straighter, and Posy had established a legitimate livestock rehabilitation program that was referenced in county agricultural reports, the question that people sometimes asked was when they had known. When had Cordelia known that Bastian Crowther was worth keeping? When had Bastian known that Silver Briar was where they'd stop? The answers were different depending on who you asked, and neither of them agreed exactly, which was honest. What they agreed on was the moment the shape of things had changed. Not when it was certain it was never certain, not really. Not the way people want certainty to be, but when it had become real. Cordelia said it was the morning. She walked the eastern pasture and understood that he was talking about the cattle the same way she did. Not like inventory. Bastian said it was the gate. Merrin, when the question occasionally reached her, said it was earlier than either of them admitted that by the end of the first week she could see it, plain as fence wire, and that adults had a remarkable capacity for not seeing what was directly in front of them when it happened to be the thing they most wanted. Posy asked the same question, looked up from whatever she was doing and said, "The calf knew before any of us," which was, in its own way, the most accurate answer. Because belonging is not a decision made once in a single moment. It is made in accumulated small moments, in mornings when you choose to stay, in evenings when you come back, in the slow work of learning someone else's rhythms and deciding that the learning is worth the difficulty. It is made in the act of putting your belongings on a shelf instead of keeping them packed, in the act of locking a gate and meaning it. Silver Briar had advertised for one ranch hand. What came through the gate instead was a man who understood land the way it needs to be understood, and 2 daughters who between them held gifts that no job notice could have thought to ask for, and the particular possibility that a wealthy woman running 2,000 acres alone might discover that what she'd been running it toward was something she hadn't known to name until it arrived at her fence line on a gray Thursday morning and waited to be judged by its work. She judged it, she kept it. And the ranch, which had been a place, became a home, not because everything fell into place, but because the people in it kept choosing each other, imperfectly and persistently, in the daily way that turns land into belonging and belonging into something worth protecting. That was the whole of it. That was enough.